Across the world's most forbidding ice and snow, countless explorers have ventured into glaciers and polar wastelands, drawn by discovery, ambition, or duty. Some never returned. Tents ripped open, diaries left unfinished, instruments frozen in time. Each vanished team leaves behind fragments of a story that refuses to be fully told. From the peaks of the Himalayas to hidden subglacial lakes in Antarctica, deadly conditions and unexplained circumstances claimed their lives, leaving mysteries that endure decades later. Step into the frozen paths they once travelled, witness the evidence left behind, and uncover the strange anomalies that continue to puzzle historians and scientists, revealing the chilling enigmas that linger in the world's most dangerous glaciers. The Dyatlov Pass incident. High in the northern Ural Mountains, where the winds sweep across barren ridges and the snow conceals all trace of life, 9 young hikers set out on a journey that would become one of the most chilling enigmas in modern history. They were students and recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a man known for his precision, discipline, and quiet courage. Their goal was to reach a Torten mountain, a name derived from the Mansi language meaning "do not go there." On January 25, 1959, they began their trek across the frozen wilderness, unaware that none of them would ever return. Photographs later recovered from their cameras revealed smiling faces and moments of camaraderie as they assembled their gear and built their last campfires. There was laughter in those frozen frames, a youthful confidence that seemed to defy the bleakness of the Siberian winter. But beyond the tree line, the weather worsened. Heavy snow and strong winds forced the group to veer off course, leading them onto the eastern slope of a remote peak the Mansi called Kholat Syakhl, translated as Mountain of the Dead. When their families received no word by February 12th, search parties were dispatched into the wilderness. For weeks, rescuers fought through blizzards and deep snowdrifts until, on February 26th, a tent was finally found partially buried in ice. It had been sliced open from the inside. The hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged inside, including boots, jackets, and food supplies. But the 9 students were gone. Footprints, barefoot and socked, led away from the tent in several directions, fading into the storm-scoured snow. It was the first sign that something profoundly wrong had occurred that night. The searchers followed the tracks downhill and soon discovered the first 2 bodies beneath a cedar tree near the edge of the forest. They were barefoot, dressed only in underwear, as though they had fled in panic. A small fire had been lit nearby, its ashes still visible beneath the frost. Broken branches suggested they had tried to climb the tree, perhaps to glimpse the campsite through the dark. A 3rd and 4th body were found midway between the tree and the tent, positioned as though they had been crawling back toward it. Each had died from exposure, yet one had a fractured skull. 2 months later, when the snow melted further, the remaining 5 were located deeper in the ravine. These bodies were dressed more warmly, wearing pieces of clothing seemingly taken from the others. The injuries found on them, however, defied explanation. One woman was missing her tongue and part of her face. Another had multiple broken ribs and internal bleeding, as if struck by an immense force. Yet their bodies showed no external wounds consistent with such trauma. A 3rd had a crushed skull, but no sign of struggle or defensive wounds. Investigators struggled to explain what had happened on that mountain. The scene offered contradictions at every turn. The tent, though torn open from within, showed no evidence of outside intrusion. The hikers appeared to have fled suddenly, some without even their shoes, into sub-zero temperatures. Radiation traces were later detected on their clothing, but the source was never identified. The Mansi people, whose lands the group had crossed, were questioned but released when no link could be found. The Soviet authorities quickly classified the case, stating only that the hikers had died from a compelling natural force. As news spread, theories multiplied. Some speculated that an avalanche had forced them to flee the tent in terror, though the slope was too shallow for such a slide, and their shelter remained intact. Others suggested they had been attacked by local tribesmen or escaped prisoners, yet there were no other footprints but their own. Reports of orange orbs seen in the sky that night led to rumours of secret military testing or even something more otherworldly. The isolation of the site, combined with the strange physical damage and missing body parts, seemed to defy ordinary explanation. Years later, surviving family members and researchers continued to press for answers. Diaries recovered from the snow were analysed, their last entries describing cold, exhaustion, and minor disagreements, but nothing suggesting fear. Their final photographs showed the group setting up their tent, smiling despite the storm. Some claim that faint lights are visible in the background of the film, though others dismiss them as snowflakes or lens glare. What truly occurred after that last photograph remains lost to the wind. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation, concluding that a rare type of slab avalanche might have struck the tent, injuring some of the hikers and forcing a chaotic escape. Yet avalanche experts have pointed out the inconsistencies, the angle of the slope, the intact tent, and the orderly footprints. Others argue that infrasound caused by wind passing over the mountain could have triggered irrational panic. No theory, however, fits every detail. The fractures and missing features on the victims remain unexplained, as do the traces of radiation and the signs that some had been alive long after the first deaths occurred. The landscape itself seems to have preserved its silence. Even today, Shackleton remains desolate and wind-blasted, its name a permanent warning. Visitors to the site have reported hearing howling through the valley, sounds that rise and fall like voices carried by the storm. Pieces of the hikers' equipment are still occasionally uncovered by thawing snow, their colours faded, their metal rusted but recognisable. Each discovery only deepens the questions rather than resolving them. The Dyatlov Pass case stands as one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries, where every theory unravels beneath scrutiny and the truth remains sealed in ice. The 9 who perished left behind a riddle carved into the white silence of the Ural Mountains, a place where human reason falters and the wilderness remembers everything. Something in that frozen night watched them, and it has never spoken. The Vanishing on the Gauli Glacier. When the glacier shifted, it revealed what no one believed would ever be seen again. A field of twisted metal and fractured glass emerged from the blue ice, glittering beneath the Alpine sun as though the mountain itself had exhaled a secret it had held for half a century. Rescuers stood in silence above the wreckage, their voices hushed by the wind that carried the faint scent of fuel and frost. Inside the opening of the glacier lay the remains of an aircraft that had once vanished without a trace, its existence erased by snow and silence since the winter of 1946. Decades earlier, a storm had swallowed the same mountain whole. In November of that year, the weather over the Swiss Alps turned violent, sweeping in from the west with a force that grounded most flights. But one aircraft, a US military C-53 Skytrooper, lifted from Munich toward Marseille, carrying 4 crewmen and 8 passengers. Among them were American officers returning home after the war, men accustomed to danger but not to the capricious fury of the high Alps. Their last radio message reported turbulence and heavy cloud cover as they crossed into Swiss airspace. Moments later, the signal faded, and nothing more was heard. On board the C-53 Skytrooper, time must have slowed to an unbearable stillness as the storm enclosed them. Lightning streaked through the clouds, illuminating the peaks below for split seconds at a time. Pilots flying the route in later years spoke of those same white horizons, where snow and cloud merged into one continuous void, making it impossible to distinguish Earth from sky. Whether the crew mistook their altitude or were forced off course, the aircraft struck the upper reaches of the Gauli Glacier and disappeared beneath a curtain of blowing snow. There were no survivors, and no wreckage was found. For days after the disappearance, American and Swiss search teams combed the mountain valleys, their aircraft tracing wide loops across the Alps in vain. Radio operators caught faint echoes of distress signals, but their coordinates never aligned. Families waited through the winter without word. Reports varied so wildly that the aircraft was rumoured to have crashed in France, in Austria, or even in the North Sea. Each rumour died when the snow deepened and the mountains closed their paths for the season. Reports from nearby villages only deepened the confusion. Shepherds in the Bernese Oberland claimed to have seen a brief flash of light near the ridge of the Wetterhorn on the night of the disappearance, while others heard what they described as distant thunder long after the storm had passed. Some spoke of metallic fragments seen in crevasses that later vanished beneath the snow. Searchers climbed repeatedly into the high passes that spring, returning with frostbitten hands and nothing to show for their effort. As the years stretched on, The lost aircraft became a legend among mountaineers, another name added to the growing list of those claimed by the Alps. It was not until half a century later that a sudden temperature rise began to awaken the glacier from its long sleep. Hikers first reported pieces of metal surfacing near the edge of the Gauli Glacier, their surfaces polished smooth by decades of pressure. Soon after, authorities confirmed what few had dared to hope: the discovery of the missing C-53. Its fuselage was remarkably intact, preserved in layers of compacted ice that had acted as a tomb. Inside were remnants of uniforms, oxygen masks, and faded maps still folded neatly beside the cockpit. Rescue teams had to carve their way upward through unstable ice, using ropes and ladders to reach the exposed fuselage. Among them were Swiss Air Force personnel and local climbers who remembered their fathers speaking of the lost American plane as legend. The recovery took days, with sudden avalanches forcing repeated retreats. When they finally breached the cabin door, the temperature inside was colder than the air outside, as though the glacier still guarded the moment of impact. Every object recovered from within, documents, personal effects, even a child's toy carried by one of the passengers, was catalogued and sealed, each item a frozen echo of that vanished flight. Inside the wreckage, time had not passed at all. Leather straps remained supple, and instruments still bore legible markings. The frozen remains of those aboard were found seated as if waiting for landing instructions that never came. No sign of fire or explosion was present, and the angle of the wreck suggested the plane had glided before impact rather than fallen. Investigators determined that the crew had likely attempted an emergency landing, unaware that beneath them lay not a smooth plateau, but a glacier filled with hidden crevasses. Yet even the discovery could not silence the questions. The flight path recorded in US military archives did not align with the wreck's final location, suggesting the aircraft had deviated more than 150 kilometers off course. Some speculated that magnetic interference from the region's mineral-rich rock had disrupted navigation instruments. Others wondered if radio silence had been deliberate, perhaps to conceal the aircraft's purpose in the tense post-war atmosphere. Unmarked equipment found in the hold only deepened the speculation, its serial numbers erased by corrosion. The cause of the deviation and the crew's final decisions remain a matter of conjecture. Those who stood at the edge of the glacier that day described the feeling as standing over a threshold between two eras. The mountain had released its secret, but only partially, as if reluctant to yield the entire truth. Each thawing season since has exposed new fragments: a boot, a torn photograph, the shattered lens of a pilot's goggles, each one emerging like a memory returning to the surface. The site has become a place of quiet pilgrimage, where mountaineers and historians come to witness the uneasy boundary between past and present. Some say the Gauli Glacier keeps what it chooses, and that the rest remains buried beneath ice too deep to measure. The Franklin expedition's frozen fate. Beneath skies that never truly darkened, two ships departed the Thames in May 1845, carrying 129 men bound for the Northwest Passage. The Erebus and Terror sailed north with the decks lined in confidence, the crews convinced they would etch their names into history by conquering the last unknown corridor of the Arctic. Their hulls were newly reinforced with iron, their holds fitted with supplies meant to last 3 years. Under Sir John Franklin's command, the expedition symbolised both the height of British naval ambition and the dangerous faith that human endurance could outmatch nature. As the coastlines faded and the cold began to bite, no one could have imagined how swiftly that faith would turn to fear. Weeks turned into months as the ice closed around them, freezing every plank and sail into place. By the winter of 1846, both ships were trapped near King William Island, imprisoned in a shifting labyrinth of white. Attempts to saw through the ice failed, and soon the men realised that the Arctic was not merely still, it was alive, groaning and reshaping around them. Temperatures plunged far below what even seasoned sailors could endure. The canned food meant to sustain them began to spoil, leaking lead into their meals. Men grew gaunt and pale, their breath hanging like smoke against the frozen air. With each day, the creak of the timbers grew quieter, as though the ships themselves were being buried alive. From within the frozen vessels, fragments of logs revealed the slow collapse of order. The last dated entry in Franklin's journal spoke of desperate circumstances, the handwriting faltering as the ink stiffened. Crewmen began to die, one by one, of scurvy and exhaustion, their bodies stored in makeshift graves on the ice. When Franklin himself perished, command fell to Captain Crozier, who made the grim decision to abandon the ships. Survivors attempted to march south toward the Back River, dragging lifeboats filled with supplies across the endless expanse. None would make it far. Inuit witnesses later described finding small groups of men staggering, starving and half mad, their faces blackened by frostbite, their hands still gripping rifles that could no longer fire. Centuries later, relics began to appear on desolate islands, preserved by the permafrost and the cold's unyielding mercy. A silver fork engraved with a name, a leather boot with a bone still inside, buttons from naval coats scattered like breadcrumbs across the tundra. Each discovery carried whispers of desperation by the fragments of men who had once been so certain of their triumph. Rescue missions in the 1850s found cairns containing scraps of paper and notes describing their retreat, but no survivors. The only remains were skeletal, sometimes mutilated, suggesting the unthinkable had occurred when starvation drove them beyond sanity. It was not until modern sonar traced the Arctic seabed that the ships themselves were finally found. In 2014, nearly 170 years after they vanished, the Erebus appeared in the shallow waters near King William Island, astonishingly intact. 2 years later, the Terror was located further south, sealed beneath layers of silt, as if the sea had preserved it deliberately. Inside both wrecks, time had frozen with astonishing precision. Tables still set, dishes undisturbed, a clock stopped at the hour its owner must have fled. The ice had become an archive, one that remembered everything except the truth. Inside the wrecks, divers uncovered scenes untouched since the 1840s. Boots lined neatly by bunks, a preserved hat on a peg, and even books whose ink still bled faintly through damp pages. The air within was stale but strangely calm, as though the ships had simply gone to sleep beneath the ice. Researchers found traces of lead in the water storage and canned food, confirming poisoning as a possible cause of madness and disorientation. Yet the orderliness of the cabins defied any explanation of chaos. It seemed impossible that such discipline had existed up to the end, unless the crew had surrendered not in fear, but in a kind of fatal acceptance. Among the Inuit of Nunavut, stories passed down through generations spoke of starving men wandering across the ice long after the ships were lost. Elders described how their ancestors encountered strangers in tattered uniforms, speaking a language no one understood. Some accounts mentioned men resorting to acts of cannibalism. Others said they sang softly to themselves as they froze, seated in the snow like statues. These oral histories, once dismissed by European investigators, were later proven to align uncannily with archaeological findings, including bones bearing marks of cutting, evidence of both starvation and survival instincts intertwined. The Inuit stories carried no malice, only the quiet certainty that the Arctic keeps what it claims. Even now, the remains of the expedition resist certainty. Forensic studies have revealed that not all deaths occurred at the same time. Some bodies were reburied, some burned, others moved long after their demise. Fragments of human DNA found on recovered utensils suggest desperate reuse, blurring the line between survival and desecration. The ship's condition adds more contradictions. Hatches sealed from the inside, suggesting someone had returned after the abandonment. Tools were stored properly, not scattered as one might expect in panic. It was as though the expedition dissolved not through chaos, but through an eerie, methodical surrender to the inevitable. What lingers in the mind is not merely the tragedy of men lost to cold and hunger, but the question of intent. Did they realize their fate too early, choosing to meet it quietly rather than fight the impossible? Or was there something about that silent sea, the endless twilight and the whispering ice, that stripped away reason itself? The truth may still lie within the wrecks, locked in journals yet unread or sealed inside a cabin untouched by light since the 19th century. Each new expedition brings discovery, yet none have reached the heart of the mystery. What lies sealed within those wooden hulls may not be the story of discovery, but of the moment the world itself went silent. The mystery of the Mount Cook survey team. The first discovery came by accident, when a mountaineer's ice axe struck something metallic beneath a thin crust of snow near the Nanda Glacier. At first, he thought it was a remnant from a more recent climbing party, perhaps a piton or a broken carabiner lost in a storm. But as he dug deeper, the outline of a metal tripod leg appeared, corroded, warped, and frozen into the blue ice, part of a surveyor's instrument that had no business being there after half a century. When news of the find reached local authorities, it reopened a case that had long slipped from public memory, one that New Zealand's Alpine community once regarded as its own unsolved riddle of the High South. Inside the small cavity, rescuers found more than just equipment. Torn canvas, fragments of a measuring rod, and the faint outline of a box camera were extracted piece by piece, each item meticulously catalogued by conservationists. Beneath them lay a small leather pouch containing waterlogged field notes, their ink spread into pale stains across the pages. Though most words were illegible, a few remained distinct enough to read, "Visibility poor, winds rising fast." These fragments, fragile and nearly erased, marked the first tangible trace of the Mount Cook survey team since their disappearance in 1933. Reports from the time described the find as minor, yet it reignited a sense of collective unease. In February of that year, the team had been sent by the Department of Lands and Survey to chart glacial movements around Aoraki, then known to many by its European name Mount Cook. Led by geologist Harold Drew, the expedition consisted of 3 others: Albert Lane, a photographer, and 2 young assistants whose names rarely appear in surviving accounts. Their task was simple enough: document retreat patterns and establish reference markers along the glacier's upper reaches. But after their last recorded radio transmission, no one heard from them again. Newspaper archives mention their intended route, yet every report contradicts another. Some claim they ascended via the Hooker Glacier, others that they followed the Tasman. Witnesses differed on when they were last seen, with one climber insisting he spotted their tents days after official records marked them missing. Confusion spread not just from poor communication but from the mountain's shifting face itself. Avalanches, crevasses, and sudden thaws constantly redrew its surface, erasing paths as quickly as they were made. By the time search parties arrived, even familiar landmarks had changed shape, as if the landscape conspired to conceal its secrets. Letters sent from their base camp revealed quiet warnings. Drew wrote to his wife days before the disappearance, describing winds that seemed to carry a voice of their own. He mentioned the snowpack as unusually brittle and the weather as unpredictable even by Alpine standards. Lane's last correspondence, found later in a postal archive, spoke of exhaustion among the younger assistants and a growing sense that something about the air feels wrong, thin, electric, as though charged with waiting. These were not men prone to superstition, but such phrasing gave later readers the uneasy impression that they sensed what was coming. No radio transmissions were logged after the afternoon of February 5th. The team's final message was partially recorded by a nearby weather station. Visibility, worsening, returning to base, before static drowned out the rest. Some argued that the equipment malfunctioned due to moisture or cold. Others believed the interference hinted at a storm system far stronger than the forecasts had predicted. By nightfall, winds over the southern slopes exceeded 100 km per hour. The search party that ascended 2 days later found no trace of footprints, tents or tools, only a long scar of disturbed snow leading into the mouth of a crevasse too deep to measure. In the chaos of wind and snow, the search faltered. Even veteran climbers could not go on. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, ropes froze and compasses malfunctioned. One rescuer noted that the air around the glacier hummed faintly as though carrying a low vibration that made it difficult to speak. The team recovered a few stakes driven into the ice, survey markers the men had planted on their ascent, but the pattern abruptly ended. The final one tilted sideways as if knocked down by force. It was there that searchers believed the group may have been overtaken by an avalanche, though no debris field was ever found. Years after the case faded, the glacier began returning its secrets. Thaws in the 1950s and again in the late 1970s revealed fragments of canvas and the remains of a tripod. Yet there were no bones, no fabric traces of clothing, no preserved human remains of any kind. Glaciologists studying the site noted that the debris field appeared scattered far from where the expedition was last recorded, suggesting glacial transport. But even then, the depth at which the first item was found did not align with the expected time frame. The ice, it seemed, had moved inconsistently, as though the objects had shifted against the natural flow. Each object recovered deepened the puzzle. Theodolites, survey rods, and fragments of notebooks all showed signs of compression damage inconsistent with a single avalanche. Some appeared bent from heat, a detail impossible to reconcile with the sub-zero environment. Hypotheses grew stranger over time. Some suggested a fall into a fumarole near the glacier's base, though no geothermal vents are known in the region. Others believed the group might have descended by mistake into a cave system and perished there, the glacier sealing them inside. Yet no such openings were documented then or since. Local Maori oral traditions, later revisited by historians, mentioned that the mountain was tapu, sacred and never to be approached beyond certain points. Auraki, according to legend, was the son of the Sky Father, frozen into stone after his canoe overturned. Elders warned that disturbances near his resting place could awaken misfortune. To them, the surveyors had entered a forbidden realm, and the mountain had simply taken them back. Though modern researchers dismissed the explanation as cultural metaphor, the symmetry between myth and disappearance left a lingering chill that rational theory never quite dispelled. In the years since, several expeditions have returned to search for the missing men, each bringing better tools, mapping drones, and thermal sensors. None have located remains or evidence of burial beneath the glacier. Every attempt ends the same way: bad weather, sudden instability, and the sense that the mountain closes itself whenever their search draws close. Geologists can explain the ice movement, meteorologists can trace storm cycles, but what happened to Drew's team remains beyond their reach. The mountain erased their path, yet their absence endures like a shadow that never melts. The Lost Climbers of Huascarán. Wind tore across the ridge, carrying with it shards of ice that glittered like glass in the thin Peruvian sunlight. The climbers pressed their goggles against their faces, squinting into the brilliance as they advanced along the brittle snowfields near 6,000 meters. Above them loomed Huascarán's twin peaks, north and south, split by a colossal saddle of crevassed ice. The mountain, highest in the tropics, had long been known for its deceptive calm. On clear mornings it shone like a polished mirror, but those who had lived beneath it spoke of an unpredictable temper hidden within its frozen mass. The German expedition of 1962, led by Dr. Hans Richter, had heard these warnings and dismissed them as local superstition. By the end of that summer, none of them would be heard from again. Far below the summit, the valley lay silent beneath a shroud of mist, its villagers unaware of the danger brewing high above. Farmers tending to their crops in Yungay looked up occasionally at the mountain's glinting crown, watching for signs of weather. The villagers called Huascarán the sleeping giant, believing its restlessness could be felt days before an avalanche. That week the air had grown unnaturally still. Dogs barked through the night, and the streams, usually swollen with meltwater, began to freeze at their edges, though it was not yet cold enough. To the Quechua people, this stillness meant the mountain was listening. The climbers moved slowly, roped together across the glacier's broken face, their breaths shallow and rhythmic in the thinning air. They had established 3 camps over 2 weeks, each one perched on the edge of vast seracs that groaned under their weight. Richter's notes, found later in a waterproof pouch, mentioned the difficulty of securing anchors in the brittle surface and a faint vibration felt through the ice. The weather reports from that day recorded no significant change in temperature or wind, yet Richter wrote, "The glacier sounds alive tonight. The ice beneath us pulses." Local guides later recalled that the mountain had sounded different that day, hollow, unsteady, as though groaning from within. One man, hired to help transport supplies to the lower camp, refused to continue past the glacier's midpoint, saying that the ground trembled beneath his boots. He returned alone to the valley, leaving the Germans to continue without assistance. His warning went unheeded. Richter, an experienced alpinist, had led previous expeditions in the Alps and dismissed such sensations as normal glacier movement. But the sound the guide described, deep, resonant, almost like thunder from the inside of the mountain, would later match the testimonies of villagers who claimed they heard the same sound moments before the disaster. Seismographs positioned nearby recorded a faint tremor that morning, small enough to ignore but strangely timed with the group's ascent. Geological records later confirmed it registered at 4.2 on the Richter scale, ironically sharing the name of the man leading the climb. Scientists debated whether the quake triggered the avalanche or whether the movement of ice itself caused the reading. What remains unclear is how localized the tremor was. No other instruments across the Cordillera Blanca detected anything unusual. The avalanche did not start with a roar, but with a faint tearing, a single ribbon of snow peeling away. A slab the size of a city block broke from the upper ridge and cascaded downward, gathering momentum until it became a torrent of ice, rock and wind. The climber's final radio message was interrupted mid-sentence. Visibility falling. Repeat, snow. Before the transmission cut to static, it was over in less than a minute. Later studies estimated that the icefall travelled at over 300 km per hour, erasing everything in its path and leaving a scar kilometres wide across the glacier's lower basin. Hours later, rescuers saw nothing but a white plain stretching where the glacier's upper camp once stood. The outlines of the tents, the ropes, and the men themselves had vanished beneath 10 metres of packed snow. Helicopters were dispatched from Lima, but unstable weather grounded them before they could reach the site. Over the next week, search parties climbed from the valley only to find shifting layers of debris too dangerous to dig through. Richter's expedition of 7 men had disappeared as completely as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. Search teams from Yungay and neighbouring Carhuaz dug through layers of compacted ice, uncovering fragments of tents, rope, and 2 frozen hands clasped together. The hands were preserved in near-perfect condition, still encased in gloves, but the bodies were nowhere nearby. Over the following days, more scattered remnants appeared. A torn rucksack, a dented cooking pot, and a single boot wedged upright in the snow. All items were found at different depths, suggesting multiple collapses rather than a single event. The official report concluded that the avalanche buried them beyond recovery, but the inconsistencies in the debris field told another story. As the glacier thinned with time, it began to return what it had once taken. Small, silent proofs of those who vanished. A team of Peruvian researchers in the 1980s discovered bones, fragments of clothing, and one camera that miraculously survived. The camera's film, carefully thawed and developed, contained several photographs taken on the day of the ascent. The final frame was unlike the rest. A blurred image of the mountain's upper ridge, dark streaks visible across the snow as though something had broken through from beneath. Experts claimed the streaks were shadows cast by drifting clouds, but others noted that the angle was wrong and the light source appeared to come from within the slope itself. The photographs developed from it told a story that should have ended long before the final frame. Among the personal effects recovered, a small metal case contained Richter's notes from previous climbs. In one entry, written weeks before his final expedition, he described Huascarán as a mountain of 2 faces, one solid, one hollow. He noted deep crevasses that emitted warm air and a faint sulfuric smell rising from vents. If such geothermal activity existed, it might explain the tremors and internal melting that destabilized the glacier. Yet no subsequent surveys ever confirmed such vents, leaving the cause of the avalanche and the disappearance of the men without conclusion. In the decades that followed, Huascarán would claim hundreds more lives, including the 1970 earthquake that triggered another catastrophic avalanche, burying the town of Yungay entirely. The mountain seemed to remember, repeating its fury on a scale beyond comprehension. Each new tragedy renewed questions about Richter's team, about what exactly they encountered on that silent ascent. No remains of the original climbers have ever been recovered. Many say the mountain holds them still, sealed within its depths as silent witnesses to a hidden heart, a frozen testimony never meant to be seen. The ill-fated Nobile expedition. Above the endless white plains of the Arctic, the airship Italia drifted through thin, frozen air in May 1928, its silver hull gleaming faintly against the dull horizon. General Umberto Nobile, a man driven by both scientific purpose and national pride, commanded the vessel with meticulous precision. His goal was audacious yet clear: to reach the North Pole once more, conducting meteorological studies and demonstrating Italy's strength in polar exploration. The mission symbolized progress, a triumph of technology over the last untamed frontier. Yet the air around them carried a quiet hostility, a heaviness that no compass could measure. Within the gondola, Warmth from the engines and the hum of machinery created a fragile illusion of safety. The men recorded temperatures, wind speeds, and magnetic readings, their journals filled with disciplined notes that spoke of confidence rather than fear. Cameras clicked as they looked down upon the unbroken white, documenting what seemed like eternity frozen in place. But every meter forward drew them deeper into danger. The Arctic sky darkened without warning, pressure gauges shifted erratically, and the rhythmic vibrations of the ship began to change. To the men inside, it felt like flying inside a whisper that might break at any second. Gradually, control slipped away. The storm that descended upon Italia was unlike any they had seen. The temperature plummeted, winds screamed through the rigging, and ice began to crust along the ship's vast envelope, weighing it down. Instruments failed one after another. The crew worked feverishly to regain altitude, jettisoning ballast and fuel, shouting over the mechanical groans that echoed through the hull. At 10:33 a.m. on May 25th, disaster struck. The airship crashed violently onto the Arctic ice, breaking apart with the force of the impact. 9 men were hurled from the gondola and slammed into the ice below, while the lighter hull, still filled with gas, tore itself free, rising back into the sky and vanishing into the fog with 6 men still trapped aboard. With the storm at last behind them, the surrounding world lay in quiet, suspended in a moment of breathless stillness. The survivors found themselves surrounded by fragments of twisted metal and shattered instruments, lying on an endless sheet of white that stretched beyond imagination. Their radio mast was broken, their food supplies were limited, and several of them were injured. General Nobile, suffering from a broken leg, crawled towards what was left of the gondola and organised the group. They built a shelter from the torn canvas, stained red by the fabric's dye, a small tent that stood like a wound against the ice. Inside, huddled close together, they waited for rescue, their minds refusing to accept the vastness of their isolation. Amid the cold's relentless grip, the survivors marked time by the weak cycle of light and dark. They rationed their food, melted snow for water, and tried to maintain their radio transmitter. Each message sent into the ether carried the same plea: Italia, survivors on the ice, immediate rescue needed. But the storm's interference and the radio's damage ensured their voices vanished into the void. Hunger clawed at them. Frostbite turned fingers black. One by one, injuries worsened. The red tent became a world of murmurs and prayer, its fabric fluttering like a heartbeat against the wind. Elsewhere, their disappearance sent shockwaves across the world. News of Italia's crash reached Europe within days, sparking an international rescue effort unprecedented in polar history. Dozens of ships and aircraft from Italy, Norway, Sweden, and the Soviet Union scoured the ice, braving storms and fog in search of any sign of life. Among those who joined was Roald Amundsen, the celebrated Norwegian explorer who had once competed with Nobile for Arctic fame. In a gesture of humanity, or perhaps guilt, Amundsen took off aboard a French seaplane to aid the rescue. His aircraft vanished without a trace over the Barents Sea, never to be found. In trying to save the lost, the Arctic had claimed another legend. Time passed, and despair began to settle like frost on the survivors' minds. Days became weeks. One man wandered into the storm and never returned. Another succumbed quietly during the night. Their tent, once a beacon of hope, turned into a memorial in real time. Then, against all odds, a faint radio signal from their broken transmitter reached a Russian operator hundreds of miles away. It was faint, barely decipherable, but enough to confirm they were alive. Soon after, a Soviet icebreaker and an aircraft dispatched from Spitsbergen began to close in on their coordinates. Beyond the immediate relief, questions began to shadow the rescue. When Nobile was airlifted first, chosen because of his injuries, it left his men behind for days longer. Critics back home accused him of abandoning them, of prioritising his survival over theirs. The Italian government, once proud of its polar hero, turned its back. Investigations into the expedition's failure became political battlegrounds, filled with accusations and rumours. Nobile, once hailed as the pioneer of polar flight, lived the rest of his life in disgrace, haunted by the ghosts of his crew and the unanswered question of what became of those carried away by the airship when it rose into the clouds. Gradually, as the decades passed, the ice buried all remaining traces. Expeditions returned to the crash site, locating pieces of the gondola, scattered journals and tools half swallowed by snow. No one ever recovered the missing portion of Italia or the 6 men it carried. The Arctic's currents and winds had erased their path as though it had never existed. Theories emerged. Some spoke of an explosion aloft, others of starvation or madness among those trapped in the drifting hull, but none were proven. The mystery remained sealed beneath ice that never yields its dead willingly. Nowhere in the vast white expanse has the Arctic wind ever returned their voices, nor revealed where the rest of Italia came to rest beneath the frozen sea. The silent descent of the K2 Glacier Party. At first light, the slopes of K2 appeared immaculate, glittering, wind-scoured, and deceptively serene. The air was thin enough to strip sound from breath, and the faint tracks left by the expedition seemed to vanish as soon as they were made. In late July of 1939, a multinational team led by Fritz Wiesner began its attempt on the world's second highest peak, a mountain infamous for its hostility and allure. They carried ropes frozen stiff from nights at altitude, axes dulled by ice, and ambitions that had already cost lives on these same ridges. By the time they reached the high camps, the mountain had begun to change. The weather that morning offered no warning, only a stillness that felt more like restraint than calm. Beyond the seracs, the route steepened into a cathedral of glassy ice, fractured and cold enough to echo beneath their steps. Each man moved cautiously, listening for the creak that might become a collapse. Wiesner pressed onward toward the summit with his climbing partner, Dudley Wolfe, while others descended, weakened by exhaustion and dwindling supplies. Communication between camps faltered as storms rolled over the Baltoro Glacier, cutting radio contact and blurring the thin line between progress and disappearance. Down below, the base team stared into the white horizon, searching for movement that never came. Inside their narrow tents, the climbers endured nights that grew quieter with each passing hour. Food froze before it could be eaten, and sleep arrived only in fragments. They recorded brief notes in diaries already stiff with frost, lines about visibility, equipment, and a creeping unease that no one dared name aloud. Even the smallest sound, the flap of canvas or the groan of ice beneath the stakes, began to feel like an omen. When the blizzard intensified, the team's position on the mountain became impossible to track. By the time the winds cleared, the upper camps had gone silent. As winds gathered once more, rescue attempts began to form in fragments. Climbers lower on the slope tried to reach Wolfe and his companions, but their shouts were swallowed by the storm. Men like Pasanka Cooley and Pasanka Tar risked everything to climb into the maelstrom, carrying ropes and supplies through avalanches that stripped tents from the ridges. One by one they vanished into the white without a trace, until only the sound of shifting snow remained. Beneath veils of spindrift, the upper camp ceased to exist as a fixed point on the mountain. Gear was buried, footprints erased, and tents shredded into tatters that fluttered briefly before being claimed by the wind. The men above were now ghosts in a storm that had forgotten their names. For weeks the base team kept vigil, sending lookouts toward the glacier's edge, hoping to glimpse movement where the slope broke into mist. Nothing appeared except clouds, heavy and unbroken, as if the mountain itself had drawn a curtain across the scene. Near the glacier's throat, searchers later discovered the remnants of Camp 7, partially buried ropes, tins of food, and a pair of crampons fused into the ice. It was there they realised that Dudley Wolfe had likely perished, left stranded after Wiesner's descent. Attempts to rescue him had already cost 4 Sherpa climbers their lives. Each man who tried to reach the stranded camp was consumed by the same storm that had sealed Wolfe's fate. Their sacrifice marked one of the most haunting episodes in K2's history, a tragedy of endurance and silence. When search teams arrived weeks later, the glacier had shifted once more. Crevasses opened where none had existed, and familiar landmarks had vanished beneath layers of drift. What they found was not a campsite, but a scattering of human effort. Metal poles, fragments of rope, and an ice axe that had been driven into a wall of snow and left to freeze in place. The sense of order that mountaineering usually imposed on chaos was gone. There was no direction, no trail, only the immense indifference of K2. Decades later, climbers traversing the lower Baltoro Glacier stumbled upon fragments long assumed lost to time, a torn section of canvas, a metal cooking pot marked with initials, and a length of rope preserved within a crevasse. These discoveries reignited speculation that the glacier had been slowly releasing remnants of the 1939 team, inch by inch, as if the mountain itself were reluctant to let go. Some experts suggested that shifting ice patterns might one day reveal more of the missing climbers, yet each new expedition returned with little more than relics, the human story still buried somewhere deep within the frozen labyrinth. In the recovered film reels, scratches of light and movement revealed the climbers' final days before the storm. Faces were pale and determined, the sky blinding above them. Laughter echoed faintly through the static before the image blurred into a blizzard of white. These glimpses, salvaged from the wreckage, offered neither explanation nor comfort, only the echo of people confronting a silence vast enough to erase their names. Historians and mountaineers would debate the details for decades, but the reels gave the same answer as the ice: nothing certain. Among the scattered relics that emerged years later, climbers found a single frozen diary page pressed between layers of ice. The handwriting trembled but remained legible, a note about clouds descending fast and tents nearly gone. It was signed simply, Wolf. No one knows how long he survived after that moment, or whether he saw the rescue attempts unfolding far below. The glacier moved relentlessly, shifting his final camp into the depths of the mountain where no rope could reach. What remains certain is that the mountain preserved its silence even as decades passed. K2's slopes continue to yield fragments of that lost expedition, an ice axe one year, a climbing boot the next, each artifact resurfacing only to remind the world of how little it remembers. The wind still carries the faint echo of that summer in 1939, a sound half real, half imagined, carried upward and swallowed whole by the mountain's endless breath. The glacier never returned what it took, it only learned to hide it better. The doomed British Antarctic expedition. Across the endless white, the horizon offered no hint of where land ended and sky began. In the austral summer of 1911, Captain Robert Falcon Scott led his men across the Ross ice shelf, a place so vast that it seemed to erase distance itself. Their goal was simple in statement but monumental in scale: to reach the South Pole and return alive. The expedition's sledges groaned under the weight of supplies, and their ponies struggled to stay upright on the glare ice. Each day the sun circled low, never setting, casting an eerie half-light that distorted shadows and blurred judgment. From the beginning, the land seemed less a destination than a trial, its beauty sharpened by indifference. Within the diaries they left behind, the men recorded their world in clipped, deliberate lines, as though brevity could protect them from despair. Scott's entries began with careful optimism, speaking of measured progress and discipline, of the honour of exploration and the spirit of discovery. But as the weeks passed, the language shifted. Words like tired and weak began to appear with increasing frequency. Temperatures dropped beyond the limits of their instruments, and the endless march turned every breath into pain. One by one, ponies were lost to the cold, and provisions were redistributed by hand. Still, the tone of duty persisted. They had come to conquer the pole, and to turn back felt like erasing history itself. Inside their canvas shelters, the men began to fragment under the weight of exhaustion. Ink froze in their pens, fingers trembled over diary pages, and each night the sound of the wind became almost human, whispering through seams and corners as if mocking their persistence. The monotony of daylight without darkness distorted time itself, leaving them unsure whether days had passed or only hours. In such disorientation, faith became both anchor and burden, and for the first time even Scott's optimism faltered in his careful handwriting. At the edge of their known world, the Antarctic plateau stretched in all directions, a frozen sea of wind-sculpted ridges that defied navigation. The party pressed onward, unaware that Roald Amundsen's Norwegian team had already reached the pole weeks earlier. When Scott's men finally arrived on January 17, 1912, they found a tent waiting for them, a flag planted firmly in the snow, and a note left in the still air, polite, factual, and devastating. The photograph Scott took of his weary companions beside the British flag captures the moment perfectly, triumph hollowed into silence. Their faces show not celebration, but resignation, as if they understood the journey home would not forgive them. Through instruments carefully recorded and later found, historians pieced together their desperate return. The thermometers cracked in temperatures below -40, and the sledges became heavier as fuel and food diminished. The Antarctic wind grew stronger. filling their tracks with snow almost as quickly as they made them. Frostbite took hold of fingers and faces. Each mile became an argument with the cold. When one man, Lawrence Oates, could no longer walk, he left the tent one night, uttering words later written down by Scott. "I'm just going outside and maybe some time." His body was never found. The others pressed on a few miles more before the blizzard claimed the rest. Among the bodies discovered years later, rescuers found them arranged as though asleep, their tent half collapsed under the drift. Scott lay at the centre, his arm extended toward his two remaining companions. His journal rested beside him, its pages stiff with frost, the last entry dated March 29th, 1912. "For God's sake, look after our people," he wrote, as if appealing to a world already moving on without them. Around the camp were the remnants of their expedition. Diaries sealed in tins, photographs and geological samples that they had carried to the end, unwilling to abandon the very purpose of their suffering. The samples, examined later by relief parties, revealed rocks and fossils dating back millions of years, silent witnesses to life that had existed before the glaciers. Even in their final hours, Scott's men had guarded these fragments of deep time, hauling them across the frozen plateau as though they represented something larger than survival itself. To abandon them would have been to surrender not just to the cold, but to the indifference of the world they sought to understand. Beyond what could be measured in temperature or distance, the mystery of their final days remains in what was not written. The blizzard that entombed them may have lasted for days or even weeks. Their food stores were nearly gone, but the scientific specimens, carefully wrapped, were intact. To this day, no one knows why they continued hauling the rocks long after survival had become impossible. Some historians interpret it as duty. Others see it as a final defiance against the desolation around them, a refusal to let nature erase their reason for being there. In the balance between logic and belief, the line they crossed was invisible. In the official reports that followed, the story became both tragedy and legend. Newspapers hailed Scott and his team as heroes, explorers who had sacrificed themselves for knowledge and country. The recovered journals were published in full, and the last entries were read aloud in public halls across Britain. Yet behind the admiration lay quiet discomfort. Their meticulous records showed poor planning, failing equipment, and a reliance on animals unsuited to the climate. The expedition's failure was both human and elemental, a collision between pride and the unyielding face of nature. The more the public revered their courage, the deeper the questions grew. Yet, beneath every explanation offered, the Antarctic itself refused to yield meaning. The landscape that took them remains unchanged, their route still visible in certain seasons as faint depressions in the snow. Scientists have studied their camps, analysed weather data, and reconstructed their final movements, but the atmosphere of their passing lingers beyond reason. Every recovered photograph, every frozen scrap of canvas, seems to whisper the same quiet defiance, that some stories resist completion, even when all the evidence lies before us. Under the weight of a continent's cold silence, their journey remains suspended in time, untouched and unanswered beneath the drifting snow. The tragedy of the Mallory and Irvine summit attempt. Light behaves strangely at such heights, bending around the peaks as though unsure where to land. Shadows stretch in impossible directions, and what seems close can in fact be miles away. The upper slopes of Everest appear both magnificent and unreachable, a white so bright that the eyes ache to look upon it for long. In 1924, the mountain was still unclaimed by any human step, and to stand on its summit was to stand at the very edge of the known world. George Mallory had come to do just that, though the mountain itself never promised to let him leave. The expedition that year carried not only ropes and oxygen, but the weight of a nation's unfinished dream. 3 times the British had attempted the climb before, and 3 times the mountain had driven them back. This final journey was meant to settle that unfinished conversation between man and the highest point on Earth. Mallory, already a symbol of courage and romantic defiance, was joined by a young engineer, Andrew Irvine, whose skill with the fragile oxygen systems gave them a chance few others had. Together, they represented hope and experience, but also the tension between ambition and reason that so often defines tragedy. Step by step, the ice grew thinner beneath their boots, yet the air above grew heavier, pressing thought into silence. The mountain seemed alive with sound, the sharp crack of shifting ice, the slow hiss of wind funneling through unseen chasms, and yet the climbers themselves spoke little. Their letters home, written in restrained optimism, hinted at exhaustion behind every word. They climbed through a landscape stripped of warmth, a world where breathing became a calculation and sleep brought no rest. Each ridge blurred into another, and every movement higher demanded more than the body had left to give. From far below, a single movement was reported through binoculars, 2 dark specks rising toward a bright ridge. Another member of the expedition, Noel Odell, was watching from a lower camp when he saw them. He described the scene years later with both awe and disbelief, 2 figures moving strongly upward, close to the second step before vanishing into a sudden bank of cloud. He believed they were within reach of the summit, but the view closed too quickly. No further glimpse was ever confirmed. What he saw remains the last living sight of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. Clouds rolled in, and it was impossible to tell if they were still climbing or already gone. The weather that descended upon Everest that afternoon was said to be merciless, even by Himalayan standards. A storm of ice and wind so violent that it erased their footprints within minutes. Radio silence followed, and the camp below waited for a signal that never came. The summit team's tent, their ropes, and even their rations were later found exactly as they had left them. It was as though they had stepped upward into another realm and simply never stepped back. From the retreating ice came a whisper of the past, a glove torn, an axe embedded in frost, a tag bearing a name. These relics appeared one by one, scattered along the north face, moved slowly by the mountain's creeping ice. In 1933, an axe bearing Irvine's initials was discovered near the final ridge. Then, silence again. The mountain held the rest for decades, as if waiting for time itself to erode curiosity. Each item found became a clue that led nowhere, deepening rather than answering the mystery of how far they had climbed and how they fell. In time, the mountain surrendered one body, but not the story the body once held. In 1999, a team searching the northern slope stumbled upon the preserved remains of George Mallory. He lay face down, his skin pale and unbroken, his limbs twisted as though caught mid-motion. The rope around his waist snapped, its frayed ends burned into the fabric of his coat. There was no sign of Irvine, nor of the camera that might have proven whether they reached the summit. Mallory's goggles were found in his pocket, suggesting he had fallen at night descending in darkness. His injuries told of a long, tumbling fall, sudden, violent, and final. Searchers tried to read the landscape for answers, but Everest reveals little. It buries truth beneath silence and snow. Some claimed that the position of Mallory's body meant he had been descending from the summit. Others insisted that the absence of Irvine's remains proved they never made it that far. Even Mallory's possessions, a letter from his wife, a few personal items, and climbing notes, revealed nothing certain. The camera, if it still exists, lies frozen somewhere in the glacier, locked in the same silence that swallowed them both. Among mountaineers, their disappearance became more than a tragedy. It became a myth. Mallory's earlier response to a journalist, "because it's there," took on an eerie permanence, turning into the justification of his own undoing. To some, the climb symbolized the purity of human aspiration, the drive to confront limits regardless of outcome. To others, it was a portrait of pride, of the peril that comes from mistaking endurance for immortality. Every theory about that final day reveals less about the mountain and more about the minds that seek to understand it. Even as modern climbers retrace their route with better gear and precise records, the question remains suspended above them. Did Mallory and Irvine stand upon the summit before they fell? Each season brings new attempts, and sometimes new bones, but never the definitive proof that would close the story. Perhaps it endures because closure would make it smaller, robbing it of the mystery that keeps Everest a place of both beauty and warning. The mountain allows glimpses, never answers. Above the shifting clouds, where the air thins and time slows to a whisper, the truth still hangs unseen, caught forever between ascent and fall. The vanished researchers of Lake Vostok. The station was found in perfect order, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. Frost traced delicate patterns across the windows, tiny crystals glinting like shattered glass under the weak Antarctic sun. The hum of backup generators persisted, a low mechanical heartbeat in the emptiness. In the sleeping quarters, personal items remained meticulously placed. Clothing folded, boots aligned, notebooks open mid-page. Even the smell of chemicals from laboratory experiments lingered faintly in the frigid air. For the rescuers, the absence of life amid such precision was more unsettling than any sign of struggle could have been. In the records recovered from the central lab, the final entries were brief, often incomplete, and written with a precision that grew increasingly tense. One entry mentioned a sample unlike any prior discovery, abruptly ending in smudged ink, its meaning lost. Another recorded instrument calibration that seemed normal, yet logs showed minute, inexplicable variations over several days. Temperature spikes beneath the ice, sudden shifts in water salinity, erratic pressure readings. Analysts speculated that the anomalies could have been natural, but their consistency suggested observation of something deliberate, perhaps alive, or simply beyond human comprehension. What investigators noted most were the small, human traces left behind. A half-eaten ration left untouched on a counter, a notebook filled with meticulous sketches of drilling apparatus and ice core cross-sections, a magnifying glass balanced atop a sheet of paper, as though the researcher had only looked away for a moment. Even the scientific instruments showed subtle signs of last-minute adjustments, tilted slightly, repositioned to monitor conditions in precise locations. Every detail suggested purpose, but no narrative explained why the team had vanished so completely. The data logs revealed more than mere numbers. They hinted at the team's growing fascination with anomalies in the ice. Sensors recorded unexplained thermal vents beneath the lake bed, pulses of warmer water moving against predicted currents. Depth probes detected pockets of liquid at layers that should have been solid ice for millennia. Each entry was accompanied by observations of unidentified particulate matter, microscopic fragments that appeared and disappeared across samples. The researchers had catalogued them meticulously but left no interpretation, a silence that would haunt those who later examined the logs. Further down in the archives, communications between team members revealed cautious debate over drilling into the deepest part of the lake. Certain areas had been strictly off-limits. Warnings were issued in official directives. Yet the notes contained careful arguments for exploration, the potential for microbial life untouched for millions of years, the chance to glimpse a world older than any known ecosystem. Their fascination was palpable in each line, the calculated risk mingled with a human drive for discovery. Even as temperatures fell and isolation deepened, the team pressed onward with determination, unaware that something beneath the ice might be observing. Unbeknownst to the outside world, the researchers had also begun recording subtle auditory anomalies within the ice itself. Faint, rhythmic vibrations, almost imperceptible at first, were noted in multiple instruments near the drilling site. Some entries described sounds resembling distant flowing water, while others hinted at irregular pulses, repeating in patterns that no natural ice formation could explain. The teams speculated quietly whether these were signs of life within the lake, seismic tremors, or a previously unknown interaction between the ice and its liquid depths. These observations, carefully documented yet never fully interpreted, remain one of the most tantalizing clues to the final moments of the expedition. No signs of conflict or accident were ever recorded, yet the station's spatial layout suggested psychological strain. Laboratory instruments had been slightly shifted from standard positions, charts were stacked in unusual configurations, and personal belongings were clustered in ways that hinted at repeated, anxious handling. Diaries hinted at fatigue, uncertainty, and a growing sense of unease, often described in scientific shorthand. Researchers noted stress in subtle ways, a pen pressed too hard, lines of numbers crossed out and rewritten, unfinished annotations in otherwise orderly notebooks. Weeks before the final transmission, satellite imagery detected faint distortions above the ice sheet. Slight deviations in surface reflectivity suggested localized heat anomalies, though nothing definitive could be determined. Atmospheric readings revealed transient shifts in pressure and magnetism, coinciding with drilling operations deep into previously unexplored layers. While some scientists later attributed these to natural variations, the precise timing aligned with the researchers' last known movements. The frozen surface seemed to ripple imperceptibly, leaving a record that could be read only by instruments. Months later, inspection teams found the outpost entirely intact. Unlike many abandoned Antarctic facilities, no footprints led away from the station, no discarded sledges or equipment. Drilling cores had been left where last measured. Samples in their containment units remained sealed, unexamined. Even the living quarters reflected a temporary absence rather than a permanent evacuation. It was as if the researchers had stepped into the ice itself, leaving behind the world they had known with perfect care. Decades of subsequent study have confirmed that Lake Vostok remains a sealed, alien world beneath 3.7 kilometers of ice. Modern attempts to penetrate its surface employ sterile equipment and robotic drilling, yet human presence has never repeated the reach of that vanished team. Microbial analysis from earlier core samples hints at life forms adapted to extreme pressure and isolation, organisms that may have interacted with the researchers' instruments in ways impossible to reconstruct. The lake's hidden depths, its shifting thermal layers, and the strange anomalies recorded all hint at a reality that the team glimpsed but could never fully document. The disappearance of the Lake Vostok researchers is more than a cautionary tale of isolation. It is a riddle locked beneath ice older than human history. Their meticulous notes, the anomalies they observed, and the untouched station all point toward an encounter with something both extraordinary and inaccessible. The Antarctic ice remains patient, a barrier to knowledge, preserving secrets that no one has yet retrieved. Every drill, every sensor, every frozen fragment is a whisper of what was, a challenge to those who follow in search of answers. Under layers of unyielding ice, where sunlight never reaches and time slows to a different rhythm, something remains, silent and unseen. The Italian Karakorum catastrophe. The Baltoro Glacier stretches like a frozen river through the heart of the Karakorum Range, its jagged surface reflecting a harsh and unforgiving landscape. In 1953, a team of Italian mountaineers and glaciologists set out to explore this remote region, drawn by the promise of uncharted ridges and the challenge of towering peaks. Their mission was as scientific as it was daring: to survey the glacier's movement, record atmospheric conditions, and chart areas no European had ventured. The team, comprised of skilled climbers and trained researchers, carried equipment that represented the cutting edge of the era, including barometers, anemometers, and photographic instruments designed to withstand extreme cold. Early reports conveyed optimism, their progress moving steadily across the ice with remarkable efficiency. Initial observations from the team described unusual atmospheric phenomena, sudden electrical discharges, and shimmering clouds that hovered unnaturally above the glacier. Some members noted how the sky seemed to crackle with light, yet no storm approached. Letters sent to their home institutions spoke of awe and unease in equal measure, hinting at conditions that defied explanation. The combination of altitude, glacial crevasses, and extreme cold made every step precarious. The Italians were experienced mountaineers, accustomed to the hazards of high-altitude expeditions, but even their expertise could not account for the strangeness that seemed to permeate the Baltoro. As the days progressed, communication with the outside world grew sporadic. Radio transmissions became increasingly erratic, punctuated by static and incomplete messages. Researchers monitoring the signals interpreted fragments that hinted at sudden storms, unseen icefalls, and disturbances in the glacier's surface. One final transmission conveyed a hurried warning of something not ordinary, followed by abrupt silence. Rescue teams were alerted immediately, but the remoteness of the Karakorum presented formidable obstacles. Aircraft could not safely approach due to high winds and unpredictable weather, and ground teams faced treacherous passes, unstable snowfields, and the constant threat of avalanches. Time and ice concealed the expedition, but eventually scattered remnants were discovered. Pieces of equipment, some still bearing frost and ice, were found lodged in crevasses or partially buried in snowdrifts. A journal fragment revealed the last recorded observations, including mentions of unnatural vibrations across the glacier and magnetic anomalies that disrupted their instruments. The writing suggested that the ice itself seemed to move in ways that contradicted known glaciology, with surfaces shifting violently and crevasses appearing without warning. Several photographs, recovered in deteriorated condition, showed glacial formations that defied perspective, angular ridges that seemed impossible, and skies captured in unusual shades that could not be attributed to ordinary light conditions. Speculation arose immediately. Some proposed that an avalanche or hidden icefall had claimed the team, a tragic yet plausible scenario given the area's history of sudden snow movements. Others believed that the strange atmospheric phenomena described by the Italians might indicate severe weather anomalies specific to that glacier, perhaps involving unexplained electrical activity or microbursts. Another theory considered the impact of glacial stress, where the immense pressure of shifting ice could fracture surface layers unpredictably, creating deadly traps for anyone traversing it. These ideas, while rational, failed to reconcile the seemingly deliberate patterns of destruction noted in the recovered fragments. Equipment was strewn but largely intact, suggesting no chaotic collapse. The journals implied fear of forces beyond mere ice and snow, forces that did not follow conventional physics. Local mountaineers who had observed the region for decades spoke in hushed tones about the glacier's peculiar temperament. They described areas where compasses failed, snow behaved like quicksand, and sudden winds could alter direction without warning. They warned that the Baltoro carried its own memory, that the ice could conceal hazards for decades and then release them suddenly. Expeditions before and after the Italian team had reported similar anomalies, though none ended with complete disappearance. The 1953 catastrophe, however, remained unparalleled in its scale and mystery, leaving a void that was never fully reconciled with natural explanations. Attempts to reconstruct the expedition's route yielded inconsistent results. Modern climbers following historical accounts found fragments of the Italians' tracks, yet large sections seemed to vanish without a trace. Equipment surfaces bore scratches that could not be fully explained by ice movement, as if guided by invisible forces. Some of the recovered maps and charts contained lines drawn in extreme haste, showing paths that skirted wide crevasses and circled sections of the glacier later identified as unstable. The precision suggested awareness of danger, yet no member survived to confirm the intentions or the reasoning behind their movements. Over decades, scientific analyses attempted to quantify what had occurred. Studies of ice cores in the Baltoro region revealed unusual air pockets and mineral deposits that coincided with the period of the Italian expedition. These findings hinted at extreme environmental shifts, though the magnitude of their effects could not be definitively correlated with the team's disappearance. Anthropologists examined the recovered journals for clues to psychological stress and decision-making under duress, concluding that the researchers were meticulous, disciplined, and aware of potential hazards. The evidence indicated that the Italians did not succumb to negligence or inexperience. Whatever claimed them did so despite every precaution, in circumstances that remain difficult to reproduce or understand. The Italian Karakorum catastrophe remains one of the most haunting mysteries of mountaineering history. Each fragment recovered, every diary entry, and all photographic evidence reinforce the sense that the glacier is not simply a frozen expanse, but an entity with unpredictable behaviours. Explorers who follow in the Italians' footsteps continue to regard the Baltoro with a mixture of reverence and fear. Stories circulate of strange lights reflecting off crevasse walls, inexplicable noises resonating across the ice, and atmospheric distortions that appear without pattern. Researchers return with samples and measurements, yet no explanation has resolved the fundamental question. How could an experienced, well-equipped team vanish in such a small area of the glacier, leaving only scattered evidence and lingering questions? Even today, the Baltoro Glacier draws climbers and scientists who hope to unravel its secrets, yet the shadow of the 1953 expedition looms over every ascent. Maps are marked with caution, satellite images are scrutinized for anomalies, and journal entries from modern explorers occasionally echo the words found in the Italians' recovered fragments. The region's danger is tangible, measured in the whispers of wind across the ice and the sudden, unnatural shifts of snow and stone. No expedition has yet ventured deep enough into the heart of the glacier to confront all of its hidden treacheries, leaving the fate of the Italian team suspended in the frozen air between fact and legend. The glacier still holds its secrets, and the mountains seem to guard them jealously. The lost crossing of the Andrée balloon expedition. Once the ice of Kvitoya relinquished its dead, the world saw the grim outcome of 3 men's daring attempt to conquer the North Pole via hydrogen balloon. Their frozen bodies lay scattered across the barren landscape, each encased in the harsh silence of the Arctic. Clothing, sledges, and personal effects were preserved with remarkable clarity, yet the reason for their deaths remained shrouded in ambiguity. Decades passed before historians pieced together fragments of the expedition, reading between the lines of weather reports, personal diaries, and the few photographs that survived the ice. From the moment the Ornen lifted into the pale summer sky, a journey that had promised glory became a slow and inescapable descent into isolation. Long before the island was mapped in detail, polar exploration carried with it an allure equal parts scientific curiosity and romantic ambition. Salomon August Andrée, a Swedish engineer and aeronaut, envisioned a triumphant balloon crossing of the North Pole, a feat that would place Sweden at the forefront of Arctic exploration. He gathered a small team of companions, each trained in meteorology, navigation and photography, men whose lives had been devoted to the pursuit of discovery. Their preparations were meticulous, from the construction of the hydrogen balloon to the selection of provisions designed to withstand the punishing cold. Confidence ran high, reinforced by technological optimism and a belief in the triumph of human ingenuity over nature. The airship Ornen, meaning the Eagle, lifted from Spitsbergen beneath pale summer skies, its silk envelope swelling with hydrogen and the promise of achievement. Onlookers watched as it floated above frozen fjords, carrying its human cargo into an expanse that few had ever crossed. For a time, the ascent appeared flawless. Instruments worked as expected, and initial weather readings suggested favourable conditions. The men documented the landscape below with eager precision, capturing images of ice floes and distant peaks. Yet even in those early hours, subtle anomalies went unnoticed. Air currents behaved unpredictably, and the balloon's movement was subtly altered by forces the men could neither measure nor comprehend. Within hours, the Arctic proved merciless. Gusts of wind forced the Ornen off its intended course, while clouds and fog concealed critical navigational markers. The crew made adjustments, but the balloon drifted inexorably toward uncharted ice, carried by a sky indifferent to human aspiration. The physical strain of prolonged exposure, combined with anxiety over uncertain conditions, creates tension within the small team. Daily routines were punctuated by constant observation and recalibration, yet each correction brought them no closer to their intended target. Sleep became impossible, and even the act of preparing meals in sub-zero temperatures tested their endurance. For weeks, the trio drifted helplessly over the polar landscape. Supplies dwindled, frostbitten extremities stiffened, and hope gradually gave way to desperation. They landed briefly on fragile ice floes, only to find the surfaces unstable and the surrounding sea treacherous. Attempts to communicate with the outside world were impossible, leaving the men to rely solely on their own calculations and judgment. Their journal entries convey a sense of gradual resignation, recording observations of the unyielding white horizon, the eerie quiet, and the endless repetition of ice and sky. Each page is a testament to the human will struggling against forces far beyond its control. Their journals, later recovered, revealed the quiet transformation from exploration to endurance. Notes describe dwindling rations, blizzards that tore at the fabric of their temporary shelters, and attempts to hunt the sparse wildlife for sustenance. Mental fatigue and physical deterioration are intertwined, altering their decision-making. Yet throughout, Andrée's meticulous attention to scientific detail persisted, with measurements of temperature, wind and pressure recorded even as their situation became increasingly dire. Photographs, some partially damaged by moisture and ice, show faces lined with strain, hands stiff from frost, and the balloon in states of partial deflation. The evidence paints a story of men facing slow, unrelenting decline in an environment that allows no mistakes. By the time the camp was uncovered in 1930, decades after the expedition had left, researchers uncovered signs of a tentative attempt to proceed on foot. Sledges were abandoned and footprints disappeared into drifting snow. Personal effects, including navigational tools and cameras, lay undisturbed, yet there were no records of successful communication or rescue. Scientific analysis of the preserved remains confirmed death from exposure and malnutrition, though the exact sequence of events remains a matter of conjecture. The sheer preservation of the bodies and belongings seemed to magnify the isolation, as if the Arctic had frozen the final chapter of the expedition to keep it intact, leaving observers only fragments to reconstruct a story too vast to fully comprehend. The sequence of their deaths and the reasons for their tragic failures continue to puzzle scholars even now. Some point to inadequate understanding of wind patterns and Arctic meteorology, while others consider mechanical failure or structural weaknesses in the balloon itself. Psychological factors, including overconfidence and group dynamics, may have influenced critical choices at pivotal moments. Yet none of these theories can entirely account for the peculiar details observed upon rediscovery. The deliberate attempts to document their surroundings, the careful placement of objects, and the calculated, if desperate, measures to survive. Each layer of analysis deepens the mystery, leaving unanswered questions about how the most ambitious balloon expedition of its era could end in such absolute silence. The Andrée balloon expedition remains a haunting example of human ambition, meeting the unforgiving realities of polar ice. Maps and journals allow modern explorers to follow their path, yet the sense of danger and vulnerability that enveloped Andrée and his companions is impossible to replicate. Scholars, adventurers, and historians continue to speculate on the forces that carried the Ornen off course, the choices made on the drifting ice, and the final days spent in isolation. Even with modern technology and improved understanding of Arctic conditions, the Arctic retains the power to confound, conceal, and ultimately silence those who challenge its vast frozen expanse. Out past the ice, the wind moves through the peaks, whispering the memory of a balloon that never arrived. The mystery of the Juno icefield geologists. Fragments of weathered notebooks emerged from a deep crevasse decades after their owners vanished, pages brittle but legible under careful examination. The entries contained meticulous records of glacial measurements, barometric readings, and temperature logs, interspersed with brief notations of personal thoughts. The handwriting conveyed focus and discipline, yet some lines hinted at unease, small observations that seemed out of place amid otherwise routine scientific documentation. These fragments, preserved by the unforgiving ice, offered the first tangible connection to the two geologists who had disappeared while conducting fieldwork in Alaska's Juno icefield in 1962, leaving behind a trail of questions that no later expedition fully resolved. The Juno icefield stretches over 1,000 square miles of shifting ice, a labyrinth of snowfields, crevasses, and hidden icefalls. It is a place where the weather can change without warning, and where even experienced researchers tread cautiously to avoid the countless hazards concealed beneath its frozen surface. In the early 1960s, scientific interest in the icefield was high, as glaciologists sought to understand the dynamics of ice movement and the impact of climate conditions on Alaskan glaciers. The region's isolation demanded careful preparation and detailed knowledge, yet even the most rigorous planning could not eliminate the unpredictability inherent to such a vast and unforgiving landscape. In 1962, two geologists embarked on a survey to chart the glacier's movement and measure the depth and flow of ice layers. Their objectives were precise: to collect data over a series of predetermined transects, to photograph changes in glacial topography, and to retrieve ice core samples for laboratory analysis. The men were trained in navigation and survival, accustomed to harsh environments, and equipped with instruments capable of recording precise measurements. They carried radios intended for intermittent contact, though signal strength was weak and unreliable in the high-altitude ice fields. From the outset, the expedition seemed to follow a methodical, controlled plan, with careful attention paid to safety and data collection protocols. Daily routines demanded precision, from measuring ice depth to recording snow stratigraphy. Each morning began with observations of weather conditions, calibration of instruments, and careful notes on the glacier's movement. Afternoon hours were spent traversing designated routes, marking the positions of crevasses and ice ridges, and cataloguing surface features that could indicate shifts in the underlying ice. Evenings were devoted to analysing collected data and preparing for the next day's survey. Despite the discipline, there was a growing awareness that the icefield could not be entirely predicted. Small anomalies in snow density and crevasse formation suggested that hidden dangers lurked beneath the pristine surface. Weather patterns grew unpredictable, and subtle anomalies began to appear in readings. Temperature fluctuations seemed extreme, barometric instruments recorded sudden variations, and occasional tremors were noted in the ice beneath their feet. The geologists documented these occurrences with the same meticulous attention as they did their standard measurements, but the entries reveal a shift in tone, curiosity mingled with concern. Observations of strange sounds echoing through crevasses, sudden gusts of wind in calm conditions, and minor shifts in snow layers suggest that the icefield possessed an awareness of its own, responding in ways that the researchers could not anticipate. Even seasoned explorers found themselves questioning the reliability of their instruments and the stability of the terrain around them. Crevasses widened unexpectedly, swallowing instruments and leaving behind only traces of the geologist's passage. Evidence indicates that they were aware of the dangers, yet no notes suggest panic or misjudgment. Maps recovered alongside fragments of their journals show carefully plotted paths that suddenly end, leaving large sections unaccounted for. The disappearance seems to have occurred in a matter of hours, with only partial traces left behind for later investigators. Despite modern techniques and extensive field searches, no conclusive explanation has been found for how the two men were lost, or what exact sequence of events led to their final moments in the ice. A closer examination of the ice cores retrieved decades later revealed anomalies that the geologists could not have anticipated. These cores contained unexpected air pockets and layers of compacted snow that indicated rapid shifts in temperature and pressure over short periods. Chemical analysis suggested sudden influxes of mineral deposits from melting rock beneath the glacier, which could have destabilized the ice and created hidden hazards. The combination of microavalanches and unpredictable crevasse formation may explain why the geologists' paths abruptly ended, providing a rare glimpse into the environmental forces at work during their final days. These findings underscored the delicate balance of survival in the icefield and reinforced the notion that even meticulous planning could not overcome the glacier's hidden dangers. When search teams arrived weeks later, only fragments of notebooks remained, and instruments were found embedded in the ice near widened crevasses. Photographs and small personal items hinted at perseverance and methodical work until the very end. However, no complete field notes, maps, or evidence of survival beyond these fragments were ever recovered. The isolation of the icefield, combined with the rapidly shifting glaciers, meant that any trace of the geologist could be erased or hidden forever. Investigators faced the chilling realization that the environment itself had swallowed the expedition, leaving only cryptic clues frozen in time. Researchers attempting to reconstruct the geologist's last movements faced impossible uncertainty. Analysis of recovered fragments suggests that the men attempted to continue their survey despite deteriorating conditions, possibly seeking shelter or a safer route across the icefield. Yet, the exact location of their disappearance remains unknown, and interpretations of the journal entries vary widely. Some scholars suggest environmental collapse, others speculate on hidden icefall hazards or crevasse collapse, while a few propose that subtle magnetic anomalies may have disoriented navigation instruments. No theory satisfies all observations, leaving the story incomplete, a carefully measured mystery with a chilling absence at its centre. The Juno icefield continues to draw glaciologists and adventurers who study its formations and traverse its frozen expanse. While modern equipment allows for improved monitoring and mapping, the memory of the vanished geologist remains a cautionary tale. The icefield holds its secrets with patient silence, preserving both the minutiae of human observation and the sudden, inexplicable gaps where lives ended. Every new survey acknowledges the legacy of those who disappeared, reminding explorers that precision and skill do not guarantee safety when confronted with the indifferent forces of nature. The frozen notebooks hold a silent testimony, their stories locked away, untouched by human curiosity. The unsolved crash on the Taku Glacier. Decades after the flight vanished, the Taku Glacier remained a silent witness to unanswered questions. Thick ice stretched uninterrupted for miles, broken only by crevasses that yawned like frozen chasms and snowfields sculpted by relentless wind. Modern researchers combing the area found traces of metal fragments and frozen instruments, but the evidence was sparse and inconclusive. Maps annotated with the flight path, satellite imagery, and weather data provided clues, yet each answer seemed to raise more questions than it resolved. The glacier held its secrets close, leaving the story of the missing aircraft shrouded in uncertainty. The aircraft, a small twin-engine plane, was loaded with instruments, provisions, and the hopes of its crew. Researchers and pilots had prepared meticulously, checking mechanical systems, calibrating altimeters, and reviewing routes across the treacherous icefield. Each member was experienced, trained in both aviation and Arctic survival. Fuel calculations were precise, survival kits checked, and radios tested against interference. The confidence in preparation was evident, yet even the most careful planning could not account for the glacier's unpredictable temperament. Weather briefings had warned of heavy snow and strong gusts, yet the team believed the plane could navigate the icefield. Reports noted sudden shifts in wind direction, whiteout conditions, and temperature fluctuations capable of icing engines and instruments within minutes. The crew acknowledged the warnings but remained determined, prioritizing both the scientific mission and the critical need to reach the remote research sites. Unseen to them, the glacier itself seemed to shift, subtly altering air currents and the flow of ice below, creating hazards impossible to detect before takeoff. Observers at the base camp noted the takeoff, the craft disappearing quickly into clouds that seemed to thicken unnaturally. Moments that should have marked a routine departure instead carried a sense of unease. The plane's silhouette flickered against the rising sun, then vanished entirely behind rolling fog. Even for those who had watched thousands of flights, something in the sudden disappearance felt unnatural, a prelude to the mystery that would endure for decades. Radio logs indicate intermittent transmissions, static, hurried messages, and ultimately silence. Operators recorded fragmented phrases, weather observations, and calls for position checks that went unanswered. Each transmission grew more distorted, more difficult to interpret. Attempts to triangulate the plane's location failed, and after a final garbled message, the radio fell silent. The abrupt cessation of contact left rescuers with no coordinates, no clear indication of a crash site, and only the frozen expanse of the glacier as both obstacle and witness. Eyewitness accounts from nearby research stations added another layer of uncertainty. Staff reported seeing an unusual, sudden cloud formation over the glacier on the day of the flight, with swirling snow and sporadic gusts strong enough to affect small aircraft. Other observers noted intermittent flashes of sunlight reflecting off ice surfaces that could have temporarily blinded pilots or interfered with navigation. While these accounts were anecdotal, they correlated with later analysis of weather conditions and suggested that natural phenomena may have played a decisive role in the aircraft's disappearance. These testimonies reinforced the idea that the glacier itself, in concert with unpredictable weather, contributed to an outcome no human foresight could fully prevent. Search parties combed the glacier, following crevasses, wind-blown snow, and the faintest signs of human passage. Teams on foot, on skis, and in helicopters combed over treacherous terrain, yet icefields had a way of concealing even the largest disturbances. Snow drifted quickly, covering tracks and hiding debris. Crevasses shifted and widened unpredictably, swallowing equipment and erasing the faint evidence of flight. Investigators documented every finding meticulously, yet with each mile of ice surveyed, the certainty of locating the main wreck diminished. It became clear that the glacier had absorbed the aircraft in a manner that left only fragments for the world to find. A few instruments and fragments were recovered months later, though nothing explained the sequence of events leading to the crash. Pieces of the fuselage, frozen in ice, provided little insight into the moments before the disappearance. Survival kits remained mostly intact, yet no evidence suggested the crew had exited the aircraft successfully. Mechanical evaluations of recovered components revealed no obvious catastrophic failure. Investigators were left to speculate whether environmental factors, navigation errors, or sudden whiteouts had overwhelmed the crew, or if forces entirely beyond human comprehension played a role. Encased in years of accumulated ice, the aircraft's path is preserved in ways detectable only by advanced imaging. Through careful analysis using satellite and radar tools, experts spotted linear depressions and slight warping in the glacier consistent with the flight path. Thermal imaging also suggested anomalies in ice density, hinting at possible crevasse impacts that may have trapped portions of the fuselage beneath layers of ice. These observations provided partial confirmation of previous theories while leaving the exact circumstances of the crash unresolved. The data emphasized how the glacier itself had acted as both a tomb and a time capsule, preserving fragments yet concealing the full truth. Analysts pieced together weather patterns, flight plans, and radio records, but the final moments remain speculative. Models of the glacier's movement, wind simulations, and historical snowfall data provide partial reconstruction, yet each scenario leaves critical gaps. The plane could have been carried by a sudden downdraft into an unseen crevasse, or mechanical icing might have led to a slow descent hidden beneath cloud cover. Some suggest that the Taku Glacier, with its shifting ice and concealed hazards, may never relinquish the truth. No subsequent expedition has recovered enough evidence to definitively conclude what befell the aircraft or its crew. The Taku Glacier continues to challenge those who study it, reminding explorers and scientists alike that, even in the age of technology, the Arctic remains largely unconquered. Each investigation uncovers fragments, offering tantalizing glimpses of the vanished flight. Yet the majority of the glacier's vast expanse remains untouched and unknowable. Researchers leave behind maps, notes, and instruments, but the icefield's silent presence preserves the mystery, asserting that some stories cannot be fully reconstructed, only speculated upon. Silent and indifferent, the glacier preserves its hidden truths, denying any hint of what became of those who disappeared. The strange demise on Langjökull. The research team's camp was discovered untouched, tents closed and instruments still recording, yet no one remained to explain their presence. Thermometers, anemometers and ice flow sensors continued their silent work, capturing data that would reveal nothing about the people who'd set them in motion. Equipment sat precisely where it had been left, with notebooks open to mid-entry and coffee cups still on tables. Outside, the wind had swept the surrounding snow into drifts that obscured every track. The absence of footprints or signs of movement created an unsettling scene. Human life seemed to have evaporated, leaving only the ghost of methodical preparation behind. Langjökull stretches in slow, silent undulations, its ice ridges hiding hazards invisible to even seasoned explorers. The glacier is a place of monotony and sudden peril, where hidden crevasses open without warning and snow bridges can collapse under the lightest weight. Temperatures swing dramatically from one hour to the next, and fog can descend in minutes, erasing horizons and disorienting even those most familiar with the terrain. For the scientists stationed there, the glacier was both a laboratory and a labyrinth, its frozen surface demanding constant attention and respect. In the mid-1980s, a small scientific team arrived to study glacier flow, ice melt, and subglacial activity. Their mission was precise: to measure ice movement across several kilometers, monitor meltwater channels, and collect sediment samples from beneath the glacier's surface. Each member carried specialized instruments, and their itinerary was meticulously planned, with daily surveys, observation points, and scheduled radio check-ins. Even in such isolation, the team's routine reflected discipline, preparation, and careful monitoring of both environmental and human factors. Daily routines were meticulous, with sensors checked each morning and observations carefully logged. Measurements were recorded in both field notebooks and electronic devices, while photographic documentation captured the subtle shifts in ice formations. Evening hours were devoted to analysis and planning, and each member took turns monitoring weather changes to anticipate hazards. Despite the routine, the air carried an intangible tension, a quiet recognition that even the most careful calculations could be undone by sudden shifts in the glacier or unforeseen atmospheric events. Subtle anomalies began to appear, instruments registering unexpected tremors, temperature readings fluctuating inexplicably, and strange sounds echoing across the ice. Acoustic monitors captured low-frequency hums that the team could not explain, and seismographs recorded micro-movements in the ice unrelated to known geological activity. In journal entries, team members remarked on a sensation of the glacier breathing, though they remained professional in their reporting. These minor irregularities, seemingly innocuous at first, would later take on significance as part of the puzzle that investigators struggled to reconstruct. Meteorological records from the period reveal sudden gusts and pressure drops that would have challenged even the most experienced glaciologists. Analysis of these records shows that Langjökull experienced rapid microstorms that created whiteout conditions, with visibility dropping to a few meters in seconds. Instruments left at the camp recorded abrupt temperature swings and shifts in wind direction, suggesting that the team may have encountered unexpected turbulence while navigating the glacier. These conditions would have disrupted both visual orientation and reliance on equipment, offering a plausible explanation for their sudden disappearance. The team reported no immediate danger, yet personal notes hint at rising anxiety and uncertainty amid the frozen expanse. Mentions of restless sleep, sudden chills despite adequate clothing, and fleeting concerns over unstable ice suggest that the psychological weight of isolation was growing. One entry described an uneasy stillness surrounding the camp, where the air felt heavier and the sky more oppressive than expected. Although outwardly, the team maintained discipline and adherence to protocols, these subtle intimations of unease hint at the human toll of long-term exposure to Langjökull's harsh and unpredictable environment. Investigators arriving weeks later found the camp exactly as it had been left, with no footprints or tracks leading away. Notebooks were open mid-sentence, and instruments continued their silent operation, unaffected by the passage of time. Snowdrifts partially buried equipment, yet the overall arrangement remained intact, as if the team had vanished without disturbing a single object. Searchers explored the surrounding terrain, combing ridges and crevassed valleys, but found no evidence of travel or escape. The glacier's surface did not explain, preserving both the scene of disappearance and the questions that would haunt all who examined it. Examination of the camp's supplies hinted at a brief attempt to prepare for an emergency departure. Scattered rations and partially packed survival kits suggested that the team had considered leaving the tents, yet no footprints or tracks led outward. Some items were deliberately repositioned, indicating decision-making under stress, while other objects remained untouched, implying abrupt disruption. These subtle clues reinforced the unsettling idea that the disappearance was sudden and inexplicable, with the glacier's environment leaving no opportunity for even a partial escape. Reconstructing the expedition's final movements relied on incomplete instrument logs, photographs, and eerie accounts from nearby observers. Measurements indicated minor shifts in ice flow, while photographs captured shadows and distortions in snow that could not be fully explained. Observers from distant research stations reported seeing faint lights moving across the glacier at irregular intervals, though none could confirm whether they were connected to the team. These fragments formed a tantalizing yet inconclusive narrative, leaving analysts to speculate on the possibilities: sudden ice collapse, disorientation during a weather anomaly, or some other inexplicable force that drew the team away from their camp. Langjökull continues to draw researchers and explorers, offering both opportunity and caution. The glacier's frozen expanse, with its subtle crevasses, hidden meltwater channels, and fluctuating conditions, remains indifferent to human endeavour. Those who study it are reminded that even meticulous preparation cannot guarantee safety, and that its secrets may remain forever beyond reach. The disappearance of the team serves as a silent warning, emphasizing the unpredictable power of isolation, environment, and the uncharted mysteries held within the ice. Silent ice conceals every trace holding the fate of those who vanished within its expanse. The Vanishing expedition of Paul Emile Victor. The final messages from Paul Emile Victor's team hinted at progress, yet carried an undertone of urgency that would later prove chilling. Radio transmissions described steady travel across the ice, routine measurements, and seemingly minor observations of snow density. Yet there was a subtle tension embedded in the reports, a hurried cadence that suggested conditions were deteriorating. These fragments of communication would become all that remained of the team's experience for decades, offering hints without revealing the full story behind their disappearance. Greenland's ice cap unfolded beneath them in endless white expanses, broken only by hidden crevasses and jagged ridges. The landscape seemed infinite, with light reflecting off pristine snow in a way that disoriented both eyes and mind. Temperatures swung unpredictably, gusts of wind rose without warning, and the horizon often vanished beneath sheets of drifting snow. For Victor and his companions, the ice cap was not merely a terrain to traverse, but a living presence, indifferent to human effort, shaping the expedition's progress with invisible forces. Preparations for the expedition were meticulous. Supplies, sleds, and instruments were arranged with exacting care. Each member was trained in survival, navigation, and the use of scientific equipment. Rations were carefully measured, and contingency plans accounted for possible whiteouts, injuries, and severe weather. Every aspect of the journey was anticipated, yet the environment had its own rules that no amount of planning could fully overcome. Even as they departed, a sense of both excitement and foreboding lingered among the team. Each day brought rigorous observation, measurements of ice flow, and notes on the subtle behaviour of the terrain. Sleds creaked under weight, skis cut tracks into the hard-packed snow, and instruments recorded the glacier's slow, inexorable movement. Victor maintained a careful schedule, dividing responsibilities and ensuring that logs were updated at every stage. Despite discipline, the monotony of the ice and the constant awareness of danger weighed heavily, a psychological burden that grew with each mile across the white expanse. Observations recorded in the team's ethnographic notes suggest they were unusually attentive to ice patterns and animal tracks. Victor's team, trained as ethnologists and explorers, meticulously documented subtle signs of wildlife movement and snow formations, noting the behaviour of Arctic foxes, bird tracks, and distant polar bear signs. Some entries hint that these patterns may have influenced navigation decisions as the team attempted to avoid unstable areas of the ice cap. These careful observations indicate the expedition was actively and methodically interacting with the landscape. Yet despite this awareness, their fate remained uncertain. Unexplained occurrences began to unsettle the team. Shifting snow formations, sudden temperature swings, and faint, distant sounds on the ice. One member noted a hollow rumble that seemed to echo from deep within a crevasse, while others observed snow bridges that appeared to form and collapse overnight. Instruments occasionally recorded data that defied explanation, including abrupt shifts in ice pressure and anomalies in subglacial water flow. Though rational explanations were proposed, the accumulation of odd events created a pervasive sense of unease that permeated their journals and communications. Through their use of primitive navigational tools, the team exposed the difficulties inherent in polar exploration during the 1930s. Sextants, compasses, and rudimentary altimeters were employed daily to chart the route, yet inaccuracies caused by magnetic anomalies and shifting snow surfaces may have misled even the most experienced members. Logs indicate repeated recalibration efforts and course corrections, showing diligence and technical skill. These details highlight that the disappearance was not due to negligence, but rather the limitations of contemporary technology in an environment capable of subtly thwarting even careful planning. Private journals reveal moments of apprehension, disagreements, and fleeting thoughts of retreat, all against the backdrop of an unforgiving landscape. Notes mention minor injuries, exhaustion from hauling sleds over uneven ice, and the mental strain of isolation. One entry describes a day when the sun vanished behind a sudden storm, leaving the team disoriented and anxious. Small conflicts arose over route decisions and risk assessment, illustrating how the Arctic environment exacerbated both physical and psychological pressures. These entries suggest that even well-prepared explorers were vulnerable to the glacier's subtle, relentless influence. Personal letters and notes reveal an undercurrent of concern about isolation and the psychological strain of extended polar travel. While outward reports conveyed professionalism, private writings indicate stress, fatigue, and subtle fears among the team. Some members questioned their ability to maintain course across vast unbroken ice, and sporadic references to inexplicable sounds or shifting shadows appear in the margins of logs. These entries suggest that, beyond physical hazards, the expedition contended with the mental toll of extreme isolation and the eerie, almost sentient presence of the ice cap. When Victor returned to the last known camp, he found only traces of movement, sleds abandoned, and instruments left in mid-measurement. The camp itself appeared undisturbed, as though the team had vanished into the ice without disturbing a single item. Partial footprints ended abruptly at snow ridges or near crevasse edges, offering tantalizing hints but no definitive explanation. It became evident that whatever befell the expedition had been sudden and invisible, leaving only the frozen landscape as witness to their fate. Subsequent searches revealed scattered equipment and partial notes, but no definitive explanation emerged for the team's disappearance. Rescue parties combed the surrounding ice, examining crevasses, pressure ridges, and subglacial channels, yet most attempts yielded only fragments of sleds or notebooks. Analysis of recovered materials provided little insight into the circumstances of the vanishing, and conflicting interpretations of the sparse evidence fueled decades of speculation. Scientists, historians, and explorers could reconstruct elements of the journey, but the final moments of the team remained forever obscured. The Arctic continues to challenge those who venture into its frozen reaches, indifferent to human ambition or curiosity. The disappearance of Victor's team serves as a stark reminder that even careful preparation, experience, and expertise cannot fully mitigate the dangers of isolation, shifting ice, and unpredictable weather. Their fate lingers as both a cautionary tale and an unsolved enigma, a silent testament to the power of the polar environment and the limits of human understanding. The ice swallowed the expedition whole, preserving its silence and leaving the Arctic to guard its secret forever. The fatal icefall of Nanda Devi. The Nanda Devi expedition was conceived as a clandestine mission, a blend of scientific study and strategic surveillance atop one of the world's most dangerous glaciers. Its objective was precise yet perilous: to place sensitive instrumentation at high altitude to monitor geopolitical movements, a task that required traversing treacherous icefalls and steep ridges. The operation's secrecy added layers of tension, as every decision carried both human and national consequences. Those who undertook it knew the risks, but even careful planning could not account for the glacier's unpredictable temperament. The mission's secrecy meant that much of the planning relied on unconventional intelligence and untested strategies for high-altitude operations. Teams had to navigate not only the glacier but also the delicate political implications of their task. Routes were designed to avoid both natural hazards and potential observation by neighbouring countries. Decisions were guided by incomplete maps and reports, forcing leaders to improvise constantly. This reliance on unverified information heightened the inherent risk, showing that the operation's danger extended beyond the physical environment. Base camps were established on precarious slopes, supplies ferried with care, and teams briefed on the dual demands of altitude and secrecy. Tents were anchored into solid ice, ropes stretched across potentially unstable snow, and caches of provisions were strategically positioned. Personnel alternated between duties, balancing the physical demands of climbing with monitoring equipment and logging observations. Despite meticulous preparation, the sheer scale of Nanda Devi and the uncertainty of the icefall made every step a calculated gamble. Climbing the icefall required both precision and constant vigilance, as hidden crevasses and towering seracs threatened to collapse without warning. Each ascent was a careful negotiation between risk and necessity, with climbers probing each step with ice axes and poles. Frostbite, exhaustion, and altitude sickness loomed as silent companions, while the glacier's sound, deep groans and sudden cracking, served as a constant reminder of nature's latent power. Every metre gained was tentative, each ridge a test of endurance and nerve. Photographs taken during preliminary climbs show the glacier's treacherous geometry, with seracs leaning unpredictably and hidden crevasses carved deep beneath the snow. Analysis of these images revealed subtle shifts in ice formations between successive days, suggesting the icefall was far less stable than anticipated. Expedition leaders relied on these observations to plan routes, but the images also documented early warning signs of instability that were ultimately impossible to counteract. This adds a layer of foreboding, showing that even careful visual reconnaissance could not prevent disaster. Equipment failures and minor slips foreshadowed the potential for disaster, revealing how fragile human endeavour can be in extreme conditions. Cables snapped under ice strain, pulleys jammed, and essential instruments malfunctioned under sub-zero temperatures. Small accidents began to compound the tension as teams spent precious hours repairing tools while shadows lengthened and storms approached. The combination of technical challenges and environmental hazards created a precarious balance that teetered dangerously with every move. The sheer weight of the sensitive equipment added an invisible burden, altering climbing dynamics and amplifying the risk of missteps. Sleds and backpacks carried instruments vital to the surveillance mission, some with highly delicate mechanisms. Every extra kilogram affected the balance on narrow ice ridges and steep inclines. Journal notes mention moments when climbers had to adjust pacing and grip, often at the cost of speed and energy. These logistical challenges meant that even minor slips could cascade into catastrophic events, emphasizing how intertwined human effort and technological cargo were in creating vulnerability. Weather patterns shifted unpredictably, with high-altitude storms and sudden avalanches testing the team's resilience and coordination. Dense clouds would descend in moments, erasing visibility, while wind-driven snow scoured surfaces and masked hidden hazards. Avalanches, small at first and then increasingly violent, forced climbers to retreat or seek shelter behind temporary ice walls. Each storm left the team disoriented, their progress halted, and their exposure to both frost and fatigue magnified. Journal entries and reports indicate moments of panic, split-second decisions, and the gradual attrition of both strength and morale. Leaders grappled with conflicting priorities, whether to push forward to complete the mission or withdraw to preserve life and equipment. Individual accounts describe the strain of carrying heavy loads across unstable ice and the mental weight of constant vigilance. Tension mounted as minor incidents accumulated, revealing the glacier's ability to exploit the smallest misstep, turning effort into catastrophe. The fatal icefall claimed multiple lives, and the final whereabouts of the nuclear surveillance device remain a chilling unknown. Teams ascending in rotation were overtaken by collapsing seracs and sudden avalanches that swept across the slope with devastating force. Some climbers disappeared into fissures without a trace, their screams lost to the wind. Others were found days later in positions that suggested sudden, unpreventable accidents. The loss of life was compounded by the impossibility of recovering sensitive equipment, leaving both human and technological presence suspended in uncertainty. Recovery attempts yielded only fragments of gear and partial documentation, reinforcing the lethal unpredictability of Nanda Devi's slopes. Ropes, sled pieces, and torn tents were scattered across the ice, while notebooks were partially buried under drifting snow. Investigators pieced together sequences of events from these remnants, yet every reconstruction remained incomplete. The glacier itself appeared indifferent, preserving the scene while obscuring vital details, leaving questions that would haunt explorers, scientists, and military planners alike for decades. Despite the passage of time, Nanda Devi's icefall continues to challenge all who venture near its heights. Its frozen slopes are a reminder of the tenuous hold humans have on such extreme environments. The operation's secrecy, combined with the sheer hostility of the terrain, ensured that the full story of the mission may never be known. Even as technology advances and mountains are mapped with greater precision, the events that unfolded during that fateful ascent remain elusive, a testament to the glacier's enduring dominance and the fragility of human ambition. No record explains why the team vanished, and the glacier itself seems to have rejected their presence. The disappearance on Franz Josef Land. The Soviet team established a small station on the icy archipelago, tasked with monitoring Arctic currents and climate patterns. Their mission combined scientific observation with the challenge of surviving in one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. Isolated from the mainland, the station was a cluster of cabins anchored to the ice, its walls insulated against the wind and sub-zero temperatures. From the outset, every member understood that the expedition would test not only endurance, but also the limits of human cohesion in prolonged isolation. Routine checks and measurements became rituals, each day repeating with the monotony of unbroken ice and low Arctic light. Instruments were calibrated, observations logged, and samples collected with precise regularity. The rhythm of work and rest was punctuated only by the brief appearance of the sun, fleeting storms, and the distant call of wildlife. This endless repetition brought a strange clarity and order, but it also amplified small frustrations and tensions that quietly simmered beneath the surface. Every ration and fuel cache became a matter of careful calculation, as resupply was impossible for months at a time. Melting ice for water consumed hours each day, while food portions were meticulously measured to ensure they lasted. Fuel for heaters and stoves was rationed with similar precision, and even minor miscalculations threatened both comfort and survival. The crew's daily existence required constant attention to these details, and the relentless management of resources added a subtle, ongoing strain to an already demanding environment. Equipment was carefully maintained, yet even minor malfunctions were amplified by the extreme cold, testing patience and ingenuity. Radios, thermometers, and drift measuring devices required constant attention, as the Arctic chill could freeze mechanisms within minutes. Simple repairs demanded skill and focus, yet every failure reminded the crew that even minor oversights could escalate into serious consequences. These technical challenges imposed a slow, persistent strain that weighed on both mind and body, setting a fragile stage for the unforeseen. To ward off monotony and isolation, the crew devised small rituals and diversions, though their effectiveness waned over time. Evening hours were spent reading aloud from journals, improvising games, or maintaining personal logs. Conversations often circled familiar topics, repeating in different forms until fatigue made attention falter. Some members kept private notes detailing fears or observations of subtle environmental changes. These coping strategies provided temporary relief but could not fully counter the psychological weight of relentless cold, isolation, and the sense of being suspended far from human contact. The crew relied on each other for both survival and morale, navigating the strains of confinement and the subtle fraying of human nerves. Close quarters bred familiarity, but also quiet friction. Minor disagreements over procedures or interpretations of data became magnified in the claustrophobic environment. Evening hours were spent sharing meals, reading, or attempting conversation to stave off isolation. Yet even these moments could not entirely dispel a growing sense of unease. Mental fatigue, compounded by constant vigilance, gradually eroded the protective veneer of routine and discipline. Unusual ice formations and drifting flows occasionally blocked observation points, forcing adjustments to data collection and travel. Shifting snow bridges, hidden cracks, and moving flows required constant attention and recalibration of research plans. Expeditions to measure currents or collect ice cores could be delayed by hours or even days. Each delay reminded the team that the Arctic environment was not passive. It demanded respect, and often dictated the pace and limits of human endeavour. Ice shifts and distant cracking sounds, barely perceptible at first, hinted at underlying instability in the surrounding flows. Subtle fissures widened imperceptibly, and thin ice sheets appeared in unexpected locations, altering the landscape overnight. Some crew members noted these shifts in diaries, but without immediate consequence, the warnings were often dismissed as normal variation. In hindsight, these small observations suggest a glacier in constant motion, a slow menace that may have contributed to the team's ultimate disappearance. Notes in diaries grew increasingly fragmented, hinting at exhaustion, doubt, and unspoken unease among team members. Observations became terse, occasionally cryptic, recording brief impressions rather than detailed accounts. Some entries reference a strange creaking of ice, distant shadows on the horizon, or a sense of the landscape subtly shifting around them. These marginal notes suggest a psychological strain beyond mere fatigue, an awareness of isolation that weighed heavily on perception and decision-making. The final entries suggest that a routine journey across the flows may have gone awry, leaving no trace of those who ventured out. The weather was recorded as relatively calm, yet subsequent entries stopped abruptly, not explaining what occurred during the journey. No logs describe accidents, encounters with wildlife, or equipment failures, leaving the disappearance shrouded in ambiguity. It is as though a single misstep, unnoticed in its subtlety, had triggered a chain of events that erased the team from view. Hidden in the remote reaches of the islands, remnants of the past slowly emerged for expeditions, relying on photographs taken from the sky and incomplete reports. A partially buried tent, a few personal items, and fragments of scientific instruments were recovered, yet none offered conclusive insight into the final hours. Arctic drift and seasonal snow cover scattered other remnants, making reconstruction almost impossible. Historians and investigators debated scenarios ranging from accidents on drifting ice to subtle environmental collapse, but no theory could fully account for the team's vanishing. What emerged from later searches were mere fragments, puzzling in their context, and the disappearance of the team remained unexplained. Each new expedition revealed a little more of the harsh landscape, yet none uncovered definitive traces of the scientists themselves. Diaries, once meticulously maintained, provided only tantalizing glimpses into daily routines and the mounting tension of isolation. Over time, these remnants became the sole testament to a team whose disappearance remains one of the Arctic's enduring enigmas. Wrapped in ice and a haunting stillness, the Arctic concealed all evidence of those who had dared to traverse it. The ghost of the Patagonian glacier camp. Snow crunched under boots as the team adjusted instruments along the icy ridge. Each member moved with precision, measuring glacial flow, recording temperatures, and checking navigation markers. The wind carried a bitter chill, stinging exposed skin and forcing fingers to tremble inside gloves. Diaries were updated with meticulous detail, noting coordinates, weather patterns, and the condition of the ice. Despite the routine, a subtle unease threaded through observations, a faint vibration beneath the surface, the distant crack of shifting ice, and shadows stretching in the low light. These minor irregularities were recorded but largely dismissed, considered quirks of a harsh, remote environment. A journal entry noted an odd vibration beneath the ice, dismissed as wind at the time. One researcher described the tremor as almost imperceptible, yet unnerving, feeling the floor of the glacier pulse beneath boots. Another recorded the faint echo of creaking, a sound that seemed to ripple unnaturally across the plateau. These small anomalies, though routine in isolation, compounded an underlying tension among the team. Each member became increasingly conscious of the glacier's scale and indifference, aware that even minor miscalculations could have irreversible consequences. Every ration and fuel cache became a matter of careful calculation, as resupply was impossible for weeks. Melting ice for water consumed precious hours each day, while meals were rationed with precision. Fuel for stoves and heaters required strict monitoring, and instruments depended on batteries vulnerable to the cold. Even minor mistakes could compromise safety or the continuity of research. This constant attention to logistics added an invisible weight, and by the end of each day, fatigue was etched into faces despite outward composure. Supplies, though meticulously prepared, were vulnerable to the environment's subtle caprice. Snowdrifts could bury tents overnight, ice could shift beneath sleds, and hidden crevasses threatened unnoticed collapse. Instruments left outside were coated with frost, some malfunctioning for hours before crews noticed. These small, persistent challenges required ingenuity, patience, and careful coordination, leaving little margin for error and amplifying the strain of isolation. A faint tension developed within the team, a quiet awareness that the glacier itself seemed to observe. Words were measured, conversations brief, and moments of solitude grew in significance. Some crew members retreated to personal journals, describing the environment with increasing scrutiny. The shapes of ice ridges, subtle patterns of snowfall, and the eerie stillness of distant crevasses. The glacier was no longer merely a subject of study. It became a presence, vast and inscrutable, shaping perception and mood in ways they could not fully articulate. To ward off monotony and creeping unease, the team devised small rituals and diversions. Evenings were spent reading aloud from diaries, sketching ice formations, or playing improvised games that emphasized observation and memory. Despite these efforts, tension lingered, subtle but persistent, feeding a collective consciousness attuned to any anomaly. Some members noted fleeting shadows, cracks in unexpected locations, and soft vibrations underfoot. These signs, though seemingly minor, became sources of speculation and quiet anxiety as days progressed. As dawn broke, the first explorer stepped toward the tents, met only by an eerie quiet. Tents were intact, supplies untouched, and instruments functioning as if the occupants had never moved. Boots were neatly arranged, sleds in position, and meals remained in place. No footprints suggested hurried departure, no evidence of struggle, no trace of any human presence. The meticulous order of the camp contrasted starkly with the absence of the team, creating a sense of surreal emptiness that heightened the rescuers' unease. Footprints outside the camp led to nowhere, halting at the edge of a small crevasse with no disturbance. Snow had drifted over the ice in some areas, obscuring potential paths, yet the placement of tools and equipment suggested nothing had been moved. Even the wind's influence could not account for the disappearance. Each investigator noted the impossibility. The scene was preserved with uncanny precision, as if time itself had paused at the moment of vanishing. A thermometer still measured sub-zero temperatures, its dial frozen mid-rad. Other instruments emitted faint signals, continuing to record the environment despite the absence of their operators. Radios offered only static, and notebooks remained open to passages that ended abruptly. These artifacts implied that the team had been interrupted mid-task, leaving the scene frozen in a moment of suspended activity. Small items, a pair of gloves, a map, a surveying tool, lay exactly where they had been last used, unaltered and undisturbed. Expanding their efforts, the team explored the neighbouring icefields and scattered ridges in hopes of finding clues. they discovered scattered footprints that stopped abruptly, half-buried notes in the snow, and sleds partially hidden by drifting ice. Analysis of snow patterns and wind flow suggested no sudden avalanche or natural collapse. The lack of bodies or displaced equipment made conventional explanations impossible. Speculation included hidden crevasses, sudden microstorms, or even disorientation leading to fatal separation, but no evidence confirmed any theory. Whispered stories from local guides told of explorers disappearing, their tents untouched and instruments still running as if the owners had simply vanished. Though such stories were often dismissed as folklore, they resonated with investigators, echoing the inexplicable findings at the camp. The glacier seemed to maintain a silent authority, preserving both clues and questions while resisting human attempts to impose order or explanation. These accounts framed the disappearance as more than an accident, hinting at the glacier's enduring enigmatic presence. The remnants of tents, sleds, and instruments bore witness to human endeavour while offering no solution. Diaries, partially filled and frozen in place, hinted at minor observations, fleeting unease, and meticulous care, yet they ended abruptly. Every object, every mark in the snow seemed intentionally placed yet devoid of explanation. The scene presented a paradox: evidence of human presence in perfect order, but no trace of the individuals who had created it. In the end, investigators determined that the Patagonian glacier had locked the mystery within its ice, both shielding and obscuring the truth. Every attempt to reconstruct the last hours yielded nothing definitive. While environmental hazards were documented, no combination of known risks could fully account for the disappearance. Over time, the event became a case study in unexplained Arctic-like vanishings, a reminder that even disciplined, experienced teams could fall victim to the silent authority of ice. Secrets lie locked within the ice, and the explorers have vanished, leaving no trace behind. The doomed mission to the Alpine ice caves. Lying in unusual order across the ice, the expedition's equipment suggested it had been moved with purpose before the vanishings. Notebooks were open, pencils frozen in mid-scribble, and surveying instruments tilted at impossible angles. Rope coils and harnesses were neatly arranged, yet some sleds bore faint scratches, suggesting a hurried adjustment. Nothing indicated panic, and yet the arrangement implied a sudden, unexplained halt to activity. Rescuers approached cautiously, aware that even subtle clues might reveal a story the glacier was unwilling to tell. Every detail, no matter how small, seemed deliberately preserved, leaving the scene both vivid and haunting. A half-filled journal contained sketches of ice formations, their angles impossible to reconcile with later observations. Narrow tunnels were depicted with precise lines, while wider chambers appeared warped, as though the artist had perceived the cave differently than it existed. Marginal notes described fleeting sounds, shifting shadows, and cold gusts that surprised even experienced explorers. Some entries hinted at unease, a creeping sense that the ice itself was active, responding to the presence of intruders. These annotations, fragmented and interrupted, created a picture of both scientific diligence and growing apprehension. Temperature gauges left in narrow tunnels fluctuated sharply, recording patterns that confounded standard measurement. One gauge dropped unexpectedly by several degrees in seconds, only to rise again with no apparent cause. Another recorded a subtle pulse, a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. Analysts later noted that such anomalies were consistent with localized airflow through hidden fissures, yet no survey at the time had accounted for them. The ice caves, long considered static, revealed themselves as dynamic and unpredictable, asserting a silent authority over the explorers' movements. Sled tracks ended abruptly, pointing toward a wall of ice that had no visible entry or exit. Marks in the snow suggested deliberate navigation, yet they vanished into solid ice. Attempts to reconstruct the route revealed tiny fissures, faint cracks, and unexpected ice ridges that had shifted since the explorers' last recorded position. These discrepancies frustrated every effort to determine the team's path and underscored the cave's mutable nature. Even the most methodical mapping could not anticipate the glacier's subtle rearrangements, leaving rescuers bewildered and cautious. Fragments of surveying instruments lay twisted, some encased in frost, as if frozen mid-use. Compass needles spun without cause, and altimeters displayed readings that contradicted the physical layout. Small measuring devices were left in positions inconsistent with the team's earlier plans, suggesting an abrupt interruption. Each anomaly reinforced the impression that the caves themselves dictated the conditions, creating dangers both tangible and unseen. Human error alone could not explain the precision of these disruptions, hinting at forces hidden deep within the ice. Condensation patterns on cave walls implied the presence of human breath, yet no one remained. Fog traced the curves of tunnels and chambers, forming shapes that suggested recent passage. Frosted footprints led nowhere, fading as if absorbed by the cave itself. Even the faint warmth left in gloves and clothing dissipated more quickly than expected, leaving equipment cold and unresponsive. These subtle signs pointed to a presence that vanished without a trace, emphasizing the thin line between exploration and disappearance in such an unforgiving environment. Maps recovered from backpacks showed annotations that contradicted what the tunnels revealed days later. Circles, arrows, and notes about ice formations could not be matched to later measurements, as if the cave had shifted while unobserved. Rooms depicted as open spaces were found narrower or partially collapsed, and small fissures noted as insignificant were now gaping hazards. The explorers' careful recordings became a puzzle offering only partial clarity. Each recovered map became evidence of both meticulous planning and the cave's inescapable unpredictability. Audio recordings captured faint, unexplained echoes that could not be replicated, suggesting an unknown source within the ice. Low, rhythmic sounds were punctuated by sharp cracks, whispering almost like distant voices. Attempts to reproduce these phenomena using identical conditions failed, deepening the sense of mystery. Scientists hypothesized about subglacial air pockets, ice resonance, or the movement of hidden streams, but no explanation was conclusive. The recordings remained haunting artifacts, fragments of a presence that had disappeared, leaving questions that echoed as persistently as the sounds themselves. Even the smallest details seemed to resist ordinary explanation. A partially eaten meal sat atop a collapsed sled, untouched yet oddly positioned. Tools were coated in frost in ways inconsistent with natural accumulation. Personal items such as gloves, notebooks, and thermoses were left in precise arrangements, as if paused mid-use. Each fragment suggested that human intention had been abruptly interrupted by circumstances beyond comprehension. The cave preserved every moment, every act, every minor decision, yet concealed the ultimate fate of those who had entered. Attempts to recreate the explorer's route met with repeated frustration. Narrow corridors had shifted, ice ridges blocked passage, and tunnels collapsed unexpectedly. Guides who had previously mapped the region noted that the glacier's inner chambers were prone to imperceptible shifts, but the degree of change in this expedition exceeded known patterns. Every attempt to piece together the final hours became a study in futility, emphasizing the cave's silent control over both perception and reality. Partial diary fragments revealed only glimpses of the last moments. Notes described cold gusts, sudden shadows, and the faint echo of footsteps behind them. Words trail off mid-sentence, leaving events incomplete and open to interpretation. Sketches indicate areas where the floor might have shifted or the ceiling creviced unexpectedly. Combined with the equipment anomalies, these fragments painted a picture of escalating danger, a labyrinth where human knowledge and preparation proved insufficient against the unpredictable environment. Even after extensive investigation, nothing definitively explained why the team vanished. The remaining evidence, twisted tools, erratic instrument readings, incomplete maps and diary fragments, offered hints but no resolution. The ice caves preserved a narrative that was simultaneously vivid and inaccessible, a story told in whispers, frost and shadows. Experts acknowledged the explorers' skill and planning, yet admitted that the environment's complexity surpassed comprehension, leaving the ultimate fate of the mission suspended in uncertainty. The Alpine ice caves hide their secrets, and curiosity may be the only witness left behind. The lost traverse of the Siachen Glacier. The Siachen Glacier, stretching across the jagged ridges of the eastern Karakorum range, has long been considered one of the most formidable and inhospitable stretches of ice on the planet. Its slopes rise sharply, jagged seracs tower over deep crevasses, and avalanches strike without warning, leaving the unprepared vulnerable to the glacier's unforgiving nature. In the spring of 1979, a small team of mountaineers and glaciologists set out to traverse a particularly isolated section of this frozen expanse, seeking to map uncharted passages and study the glacier's shifting ice. What they encountered would become one of the most confounding disappearances in modern mountaineering history. The expedition consisted of 6 experienced climbers, each chosen for their skill in high-altitude survival and their previous work in glaciology. They carried equipment designed for months in extreme cold, sleds loaded with food rations, scientific instruments for ice sampling, and climbing gear sturdy enough to anchor into ice shelves. Their departure was celebrated by local military observers and scientific colleagues, who noted the unusual ambition of this traverse. No party had attempted to cross this segment of Siachen without heavy support, and the team's independence added to the tension surrounding the mission. Initial reports indicated favourable weather, with clear skies revealing the glacier's sprawling labyrinth of ridges and crevasses. In the first week, the team reported steady progress. Observers at the base camp received routine messages detailing minor adjustments to their route and occasional discoveries of new ice formations. The communications were meticulous, demonstrating a careful attention to safety and detail. Yet beneath the surface of these reports, subtle anomalies began to emerge. The tone of one message hinted at rising concern over sudden snowdrifts that blocked established paths. Another described equipment that had become buried in soft snow during an unexpected storm. Though these issues were minor individually, they suggested the glacier itself was altering in ways difficult to predict, creating hazards that no preparation could fully mitigate. By the second week, the expedition had reached the higher reaches of the glacier, where the terrain narrowed and the ice thickened into a continuous white plateau, broken only by the occasional blue crevasse. The team's communications grew increasingly sporadic. One brief transmission noted the difficulty of navigating over an area riddled with hidden fissures, but it contained no hint of the danger that lay ahead. A final message, transmitted late at night, mentioned the appearance of strange ice formations resembling cliffs and arches, as if the glacier had reshaped itself overnight. After that, all contact ceased. Missing their scheduled communication, the team triggered an urgent search effort. Helicopters scoured accessible portions of the glacier, but Siachen's extreme altitude and treacherous terrain hindered progress. Snowstorms limited visibility and forced searchers to descend repeatedly to safe altitudes. Ground teams combed the edges of ridges, noting collapsed tents and partially buried sleds in locations that suggested the team had attempted to traverse unstable areas. Yet no human traces were found beyond these scattered belongings. The glacier appeared to have swallowed the expedition without leaving evidence of what had become of the climbers themselves. Upon examining the abandoned equipment, investigators observed that all instruments remained properly arranged, no supplies were missing, and the sleds showed no signs of forceful tampering. The configuration implied the team had moved cautiously, following standard glacial protocols, yet something disrupted their path so completely that they vanished entirely. Speculation arose regarding sudden crevasse collapses or avalanches that could have transported the climbers and gear into deep ice chasms, but the absence of physical evidence prevented any conclusive theory. The glacier, in its silent immensity, refused to yield its secrets. Local shepherds and military personnel stationed nearby offered additional perspectives. Some recounted stories of travellers who had vanished on the glacier, of sudden whiteouts that appeared without warning, and of sounds of shifting ice that carried across the frozen plains. These accounts were dismissed by some investigators as folklore, yet the consistency of descriptions across decades added weight to the notion that the glacier's dynamics could create phenomena that even skilled climbers could not anticipate. Observers noted that the Siachen Glacier had a history of sudden ice collapses, and combined with sub-zero temperatures, the environment left little hope for survival once a party became disoriented or trapped. With the aid of satellite scans and historical topography, researchers worked to chart the expedition's final route long after it vanished. Analysis suggested that the team had aimed to pass through a narrow corridor known for its unstable seracs. These ice towers, some exceeding several dozen meters, were prone to collapse with minimal warning, often triggering secondary slides along the ice slopes. It is likely that the climbers, progressing cautiously through this corridor, encountered a sudden event that left no room for retreat. Yet, without bodies or personal accounts, every reconstruction remained speculative, a shadowy approximation of what may have transpired on the glacier's indifferent surface. The story of the 1979 expedition has persisted in glaciology circles and mountaineering lore because it remains an unresolved enigma. Unlike other disasters where wreckage or remains provide some measure of closure, the Siachen Traverse left only its empty trails and scattered equipment. Subsequent attempts to map the glacier's high reaches have confirmed the inherent instability of the areas the team had sought to cross. Crevasses remain deep and hidden beneath soft layers of snow, and seracs continue to collapse unpredictably. In some locations, the glacier appears to shift over the course of months, erasing footprints, tracks, and even large caches of gear, as if the ice itself consumes all evidence of human passage. The mystery is compounded by the absence of corroborating accounts. No other parties reported seeing the climbers after their departure, and no emergency signals were received. It is as if the expedition, despite careful preparation and experience, vanished into an isolated world within the glacier that exists apart from the reality outside its frozen borders. Every attempt to locate the team or reconstruct their experience has encountered the same frustrating obstacle. The glacier is alive with movement and unpredictability, making any search or analysis only partially effective. Unnaturally positioned equipment offered a silent testimony to the deliberate actions taken before the team was lost. Articles and studies examine potential explanations, ranging from crevasse falls to sudden ice slides, yet no theory fully accounts for the complete absence of human remains. The disappearance serves as a stark reminder of the glacier's lethal nature and the fine line between expertise and catastrophe. Maps chart its ridges and valleys, and scientists monitor ice flows with precision instruments, but the heart of the glacier remains impenetrable, indifferent to human ambition or tragedy. The 1979 adventurers may still lie beneath the glacier's restless surface, the ice preserving and obscuring them from anyone above. The vanishing of the Carluck crew. Preparations for the Carluck expedition were meticulous, yet they could not account for the unpredictability of the Arctic. The ship, a sturdy wooden vessel chosen for its capacity to carry men and supplies into frozen waters, was outfitted with everything an ambitious crew might need: provisions to last months, scientific instruments to chart unclaimed territories, and a contingent of explorers and scientists whose experience promised careful judgment. Newspapers heralded the mission as a bold step toward the unknown, while the crew themselves held a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Even the most experienced sailors could not foresee how quickly ice and misfortune would test every plan. Surrounded by a shifting crust of ice, the Carluck was trapped, turning the Arctic from a remote wilderness into a confining prison. Logbooks describe the slow creep of the ice around the hull, as if the glacier were alive and patient, pressing against timbers with inexorable weight. Days stretched into weeks, and the crew's initial hope that the thaw would free them gave way to grim realization. Instruments were consulted, maps scrutinized, and attempts to chip away at the ice proved futile. The vessel, once a symbol of human control, now existed at the mercy of the Arctic's quiet force. Isolated reports and recovered artifacts preserve fragments of the crew's journey after their ship became trapped. Tattered journals, scattered supplies, and temporary shelters discovered along ice floes offered hints of desperate treks across broken terrain. Notes scribbled on scraps of paper hint at starvation, extreme cold, and the relentless pressure of a white wilderness that allowed no rest. Each find suggested determination and careful planning, yet also underscored the impossible odds they faced. Every clue raised more questions than it answered, as if the Arctic had orchestrated its own record while keeping the full story hidden. Within the debris recovered decades later, investigators found objects that silently illuminated the crew's last days. Items such as half-buried cooking utensils, fragments of clothing, and broken scientific instruments suggested that those who left the Carluck tried to establish temporary camps while trekking across unstable ice. Some recovered notes indicated attempts to ration food meticulously, while others hinted at desperate improvisations to withstand freezing temperatures. These traces revealed the stark contrast between human-to-Canadian resilience and the Arctic's merciless reach, showing that even the most disciplined efforts could be undone in moments, leaving only fragmented stories behind. Accounts of the few who survived portions of the ordeal reveal a complex web of decisions and rivalries. Memories differ on who stayed aboard the vessel, who attempted to reach land across shifting ice and who vanished without a trace. Some described the Arctic as a deceptive calm, giving brief illusions of safety before sudden, deadly storms. Others recounted frostbitten hands and faces, tents overturned by wind, and the harrowing choice of leaving companions behind to survive. The contradictions between these accounts add a layer of intrigue, making it difficult to discern the precise sequence of events or to know the fate of every individual. Stillness pervades the Arctic even today, preserving the landscape that witnessed the expedition. Ice ridges rise and fall without revealing the secrets entombed within, and snowdrifts conceal traces that might once have offered answers. The land itself serves as an impartial witness, neither confirming nor denying the theories that arise from journals, fragments, or oral history. Investigators who have retraced the crew's steps often remark on the eerie permanence of the silence, the way wind shapes snow over buried evidence, and how even the most determined searchers can yield only partial glimpses into what transpired. Generations of historians, explorers, and researchers have attempted to piece together the Carluck's final days, relying on maps, recovered notes, and survivor testimonies. Expeditions retracing routes, modern satellite imagery, and re-examination of artifacts offer insights, yet no definitive narrative has emerged. Each new analysis uncovers further complexities: the shifting ice that could erase footprints overnight, the hidden pressure ridges that might have claimed lives silently, and the unpredictable drift of debris into the unforgiving sea. Despite the accumulation of knowledge, the story remains unresolved. A puzzle with pieces forever scattered across Arctic expanses. No trace remains to fully illuminate the fate of those who embarked on the Carluck. What the Arctic witnessed is preserved only in fragments, whispers of paper, and the occasional bone discovered decades later. The sea and ice guard their secrets as closely as they did over a century ago, leaving the world to speculate, reconstruct, and wonder. Each new inquiry is met by the same merciless void, as if the region itself resists being fully understood. Concealed within the Arctic's frozen expanse, the Carluck's crew remains, their fate hanging eternally between certainty and the unknown. The unfinished traverse of the Shackleton party. Ambition had driven Sir Ernest Shackleton to plan one of the most daring polar expeditions of the early 20th century. His goal was to traverse the Antarctic continent, a feat no human had yet achieved, crossing its vast ice sheets from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea. The expedition was conceived with careful attention to detail, combining scientific research, geographic mapping, and the sheer pursuit of human endurance. Supplies were stockpiled, sledges prepared, and men selected for their stamina, skill, and ability to endure the relentless cold. Even as the expedition drew public attention, few could foresee how the continent itself would test the limits of human resolve. The crew departed with a sense of determination tempered by caution. Shackleton's men were a diverse assembly of scientists, sailors, and adventurers, each with specialized knowledge to contribute. The ship, the Endurance, was fortified for polar ice, her hull reinforced to withstand the crushing pressure of frozen seas. Initial progress was encouraging, with clear skies allowing careful navigation, and the men maintained meticulous records of position, weather, and ice conditions. Early challenges, bitter winds, slippery surfaces, and unpredictable ice flows, were met with careful strategy and disciplined effort, and the team pressed forward with an optimism that belied the dangers lying ahead. Progressing into the heart of the Weddell Sea, the Endurance soon encountered ice fields that moved like a living barrier. The crew's path was slowed by pressure ridges and sprawling flows, each step requiring cautious evaluation. Shackleton's leadership became critical as the ice's relentlessness began to weigh on both morale and schedule. The men relied on careful observation, setting lines and markers to track movement, yet the environment proved unpredictable. In their diaries, subtle frustrations emerge, notes of delayed progress, minor injuries, and the cumulative exhaustion of constant vigilance. Every day brought incremental achievement, yet the continent's enormity rendered each triumph provisional. Encounters with unexpected obstacles punctuated the expedition's slow advance. Cracks in the ice, hidden crevasses, and sudden storms forced repeated reassessment of routes and strategies. Supplies needed careful rationing, as miscalculations could leave the men exposed to deadly temperatures and depleted food reserves. Shackleton faced decisions that required balancing ambition with safety, often weighing the desires of the team against the uncompromising reality of the Antarctic. Tension rose quietly within the ranks, not through conflict but through the unrelenting pressure of isolation and the unyielding environment. Each challenge demonstrated the fragile margin between survival and disaster. Supplies dwindled more rapidly than anticipated as the men battled the ever-shifting ice. Rations were carefully measured, yet harsh winds and bitter cold demanded more energy than planned, and every sledging effort strained both men and animals. Records from the expedition reveal that even minor miscalculations in food or fuel could have led to catastrophic consequences, forcing Shackleton and his officers to constantly adapt their strategy. The challenge of balancing daily survival with the broader objective of crossing the continent highlighted the precariousness of any polar endeavour. Retreating became an unavoidable consideration as the expedition confronted impassable ice and worsening conditions. Diaries and later accounts reveal Shackleton's reluctant decision to halt the traverse and secure the team's safety, recognising that pressing forward could lead to catastrophe. Sledges were secured, camps established, and every effort made to conserve energy and morale. The unfinished traverse, while a disappointment to ambition, reflected the wisdom of adapting to circumstance, a testament to Shackleton's understanding of both human and environmental limits. Even as they abandoned the planned route, the crew's perseverance under extreme conditions became a record of resilience rather than failure. Historians who study the Endurance expedition emphasize the significance of its incompletion. Maps and contemporary analysis show the traverse that might have been, juxtaposed with the unforgiving terrain that blocked it. Scholars examine diaries, sketches, and notes to reconstruct the expedition's intentions, highlighting the delicate balance between human endeavour and the uncontrollable forces of nature. Later expeditions that attempted similar crossings often drew lessons from Shackleton's retreat, noting how quickly conditions could shift and how a prudent leader might save lives by recognising the limits imposed by the environment. The narrative remains a mixture of heroism, careful observation, and the enduring enigma of what might have been achieved. Eternity seems to rest over the paths that Shackleton and his men never completed. Snowdrifts and shifting ice have long since erased footprints, sled tracks, and the temporary camps where decisions were made. The continent's silent vastness keeps the expedition's ambition suspended, a frozen testament to the interplay of human courage and nature's implacable authority. Artifacts, photographs, and written records offer glimpses of intent and struggle, yet the full experience of the unfinished traverse remains beyond reach, leaving scholars and enthusiasts to ponder what challenges were faced beyond the pages and images that survive. The Antarctic retains its secrets, and the traverse Shackleton's party dared to attempt stands forever incomplete. The final march on the Axel Heiberg Glacier. Approaching the Axel Heiberg Glacier, the expedition confronted a landscape that seemed untouched by time, vast and silent under a pallid sky. Towering ice formations rose in jagged formations, and the wind whispered across crevasses, carrying with it the cold of an inhospitable world. The men were struck by the glacier's scale, its labyrinthine ridges and hidden valleys offering both promise of discovery and subtle threat. Maps indicated a possible traverse, yet the terrain suggested that each step would require careful planning, skill, and an awareness that the environment could shift without warning. Early notes from the march capture a mixture of excitement and careful evaluation. The team mapped previously uncharted sections of the ice, noting peculiar formations and crevasses that could swallow entire sledges. Scientific instruments were deployed to measure temperatures, ice thickness, and movement, reflecting a dedication to knowledge amid the perils of exploration. Even as they documented their surroundings, the men were keenly aware of the glacier's indifference, a silent and watchful presence that both fascinated and unnerved them. Mistrust of the ice became a constant companion for the explorers. Even familiar stretches seemed to shift overnight, and each step demanded testing with poles and careful scrutiny. The men debated the safest routes, sometimes splitting into smaller groups to probe ahead, their confidence tempered by the glacier's unpredictability. Diaries recount tense silences as they listened for creaking or cracking beneath their feet, each sound a potential warning. The glacier required patience as much as endurance, and every decision carried weighty consequences. Weariness gradually accumulated as hours became days of unrelenting effort. The men confronted hidden cracks beneath layers of snow, shifting pressure ridges that threatened to overturn sledges, and sudden squalls that could erase tracks in minutes. Frostbite, exhaustion, and the relentless cold weighed on the team's physical and mental state. Diaries hint at growing tension and the quiet acknowledgement that survival depended as much on prudence as on endurance. Each day tested their resolve, and yet the allure of completing the traverse pushed them onward, step by precarious step. Through their written accounts, the team's last steps can still be traced. Entries became more sparse, noting distances travelled, deteriorating weather conditions, and the mounting difficulty of the terrain. Coordinates mark areas where camps were abandoned hastily, sledges left behind, and observations recorded in hurried script. These documents offer tantalizing fragments of the final march, suggesting the team continued to push forward despite increasing uncertainty, yet leaving no definitive account of their ultimate fate. Signals of human presence were scarce and fleeting across the ice. Flags, markers, and small cairns meant to guide or communicate were often buried beneath drifting snow, leaving little evidence of progress. Later investigators noted these markers when they were visible, but the glacier's ephemeral nature erased most traces. Each lost signal highlighted the isolation of the team and deepened the uncertainty of what had transpired beyond the last recorded positions, leaving only fragments of human effort suspended in the white expanse. Subsequent teams attempted to follow the paths recorded in the expedition's remaining notes, uncovering remnants of gear, temporary shelters, and bits of supplies along the way. Investigators found traces that confirmed some of the journal's details, but left vast stretches of the glacier unexamined, preserving the enigma of what happened beyond the last known positions. The evidence hinted at sudden changes in weather or ice that could have diverted or trapped the explorers, yet no conclusive explanations emerged. Each discovery deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Interpretation of the Axel Heiberg expedition remains varied and inconclusive. Historians and glaciologists analyze the notes, traces, and environmental conditions to speculate on what may have occurred, yet the glacier resists certainty. Some suggest that a storm or hidden crevasse brought the march to an abrupt halt, while others emphasize the limits of human endurance under extreme conditions. The incomplete record, combined with the glacier's remote and shifting nature, leaves the expedition suspended in a state between achievement and disappearance, its story incomplete and haunting. Still, the glacier keeps its secrets as tightly as it ever has. Snowfields and ice ridges conceal tracks, equipment, and traces of human endeavour, preserving the final march in an eerie silence. What the men faced in those concluding days is known only through fragments and speculation, leaving the world to imagine the trials they endured and the choices that may have sealed their fate. Even decades later, the Axel Heiberg Glacier stands as a vast, indifferent witness, guarding the ultimate truth of the expedition from all who attempt to uncover it. The glacier swallows their story, leaving only whispers of footsteps lost to time. The vanishing of the Yamal ice team. Arrival on the remote expanse of the Yamal Peninsula revealed a frozen landscape both stark and unyielding. The ice team, composed of seasoned scientists and explorers, had travelled into one of the most isolated regions of Siberia, intending to study permafrost, glacial formations, and atmospheric conditions. Their equipment was carefully unloaded, and temporary shelters were established amid the drifting snow and jagged ice ridges. Even in these early days, the vastness of the terrain impressed itself upon the men, a constant reminder that in such isolation, the environment was both their laboratory and their adversary. Routine quickly settled over the team as they began the meticulous tasks of observation and measurement. Instruments were calibrated, soil and ice samples collected, and data meticulously recorded in logbooks. Despite the technical precision required, the work was physically exhausting. The men contended with sub-zero temperatures, sudden gusts of wind, and the hidden danger of thin ice beneath the surface. Diaries reflect a mixture of professional focus and quiet awe, hinting at the subtle tension that arises when humans confront landscapes far larger and more indifferent than themselves. Movements recorded in the early days of the expedition show a team both methodical and adaptive, navigating crevassed terrain and improvising when sledges became stuck in snowdrifts. Observers noted their careful use of ropes and temporary bridges over fragile ice, a rhythm of progress punctuated by moments of uncertainty. These logistical details, though mundane, now take on a foreboding quality, hinting at the fragility of human planning in a landscape capable of erasing every trace in hours. Warnings emerged in small, unsettling ways. Equipment would occasionally malfunction under inexplicable conditions, notes of sudden whiteouts were recorded, and minor shifts in ice ridges suggested the glacier's slow, imperceptible movement. Colleagues recalled subtle changes in the team's demeanour, anxiety in tone, hesitation in movement, though no single event seemed severe enough to warrant concern. In hindsight, these early signals appear as ominous foreshadowing, minute indications of the forces that would soon overwhelm even the most experienced expeditioners. Atmospheric readings recorded during the expedition reveal unusual fluctuations in barometric pressure and temperature that would have affected ice stability and visibility. Sudden, sharp drops in pressure coincided with fierce gusts capable of shifting snowdrifts and obscuring tracks within minutes. Some logs note strange light phenomena on the horizon, fleeting illuminations that the team could not explain. While subtle at the time, these environmental anomalies may have contributed to disorientation, complicating navigation and heightening the risk of unseen hazards in a landscape already hostile and unforgiving. What caused the disappearance remains a mystery. One morning, the team's camp was found intact but eerily empty. Sledges stood ready, instruments untouched, and fires left smouldering. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, and no distress signals were recovered. It was as if the ice itself had swallowed the men, leaving only the remnants of their carefully maintained camp. Search parties combed the area, scouring ridges, crevasses, and snowfields, but the traces they sought were elusive, disappearing into the relentless, shifting white. Recovery efforts yielded fragments of evidence, but nothing that could fully explain the vanishing. A few journals were found buried under snow, their entries abruptly ending mid-sentence. Some scientific instruments were recovered miles from the last known camp, suggesting movement or drift, yet there was no clear path linking these artifacts to the team's fate. Each piece of evidence hinted at human presence, yet simultaneously reinforced the impenetrable mystery. Even trained investigators struggled to reconstruct what had transpired, confronted by both the glacier's indifference and the gaps in the record. Speculation has ranged from the mundane to the extraordinary. Scientists and historians suggest that shifting ice, sudden crevasses, or unexpected weather could have claimed the team. Others point to the psychological strain of isolation in extreme conditions, proposing that panic or disorientation may have played a role. Some theories remain more mysterious, invoking the unpredictable behaviour of the Arctic environment itself, a realm where even the most experienced explorers are sometimes rendered invisible. Decades of research and inquiry have yielded insights, but never certainty, leaving the fate of the Yamal ice team suspended between knowledge and conjecture. Oblivion seems to rest over the areas where the men vanished. The landscape preserves no clear record, only the imprint of human effort erased by wind, snow, and shifting ice. Modern satellite imagery and repeated expeditions reveal little more than the frozen expanse itself, unchanging yet inscrutable. Whatever occurred during those final days remains locked in the ice, a chilling reminder of the fragility of human endeavour in extreme isolation and the persistent authority of nature over all who venture too far into its dominion. The Arctic holds its fate in silence, and no one has yet discovered what became of the Yamal ice team.